Welcome to the Midnight Echoes. Before we dive into tonight's stories, I'd love to know, where are you watching from and what time is it there? Drop a comment below. It's always fascinating to see where our viewers are tuning in from. If you enjoy the stories, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. Now let's get comfortable, unwind, and prepare for tonight's eerie adventures. We were just looking for a weekend escape, a simple hike through the forest to clear our heads. There were 4 of us, longtime friends who had been hiking together for years. We thought we knew these woods like the back of our hands. The plan was to take one of the less traveled trails and camp for the night, far from civilization. But it turns out, we weren't the only ones out there. We had no idea that deep in the wilderness, there was something sinister waiting for us. As we hiked further from the main trail, we noticed something odd. The air felt heavier, and the forest was unusually quiet. No birds, no rustling leaves, just an eerie silence. Then, out of nowhere, we saw it. An old, run-down cabin hidden behind thick brush. The windows were boarded up, and a faint chemical smell hung in the air. We should have turned back right then, but curiosity got the better of us. That was our first mistake. We crept closer, peering through the cracks in the boards. Inside, we saw people, rough-looking guys with hard expressions, handling equipment that clearly wasn't meant for a casual camping trip. It didn't take long to realize what we had stumbled upon: a meth lab. Panic set in immediately. We knew this was bad news. These weren't the kind of people you wanted to cross paths with, especially out here, miles from help. We had to get out of there, fast. Just as we turned to leave, a twig snapped under my friend's foot, and it felt like the entire forest held its breath. Within seconds, one of the men from the cabin appeared, scanning the woods. "Hey!" he shouted. "I see you!" My heart dropped. We took off running without looking back, crashing through the underbrush as fast as we could. The sounds of footsteps and shouting followed close behind, growing louder and more threatening with each passing second. The forest, once our sanctuary, became a maze of terror. Branches whipped at our faces, and the ground was uneven and slippery, but we kept running. Behind us, I could hear the men yelling, their voices getting closer. Every few moments, I could hear a sharp crack. Gunshots. They were shooting at us. My legs felt like they were made of lead, but the adrenaline kept me moving. I couldn't stop. Stopping meant certain death. We were completely lost by now, running blindly through the woods with no sense of direction. Eventually, we came upon a dense thicket and crawled through, the thorns tearing at our clothes and skin. On the other side, we found a small cave, hidden by thick vines. It wasn't much, but it was all we had. We slipped inside, huddling together in the darkness, praying they wouldn't find us. We could hear them searching nearby, their voices low and threatening. The night dragged on, every sound making our hearts race. The cold, damp air chilled us to the bone, but none of us dared to speak. We barely breathed. Outside, the footsteps came and went, sometimes so close we could hear the crunch of leaves under their boots. Time seemed to stretch endlessly. We didn't know if we'd make it through the night, but we had no choice but to wait. Dawn finally broke, the first light filtering through the trees. We still didn't dare leave the cave until we were sure the men had moved on. When we finally crawled out, exhausted and scared, the woods were quiet again. Too quiet. We debated what to do next. We had no signal, no way to call for help, and we were still miles from civilization. We needed to keep moving, but every step felt like walking through a minefield. Just when we thought we were in the clear, we heard the distant rumble of an engine. A truck making its way down the old forest road. Our hearts sank as we scrambled to hide again, fearing the men had come back. But to our shock, it wasn't them. It was the police. A local hunter had stumbled upon the lab and reported it earlier that morning. They had no idea we were out here, running for our lives. The relief that washed over us when we saw those flashing lights was overwhelming. We stumbled out of the woods, bruised, cut, and shaken, but alive. The officers asked us 100 questions, but we barely had the energy to answer. All we could do was point them in the direction of the cabin, knowing full well what they'd find. The men who chased us weren't caught, but the lab was shut down, and the woods, at least for now, were safe again. Even after we returned home, the experience haunted us. The chilling silence of the forest, the eerie chemical smell, the fear of being hunted. It stayed with us long after we left. I couldn't shake the feeling that those men were still out there somewhere. And now, whenever I go hiking, I can't help but wonder what else might be hiding in the places we think we know so well. I never expected my quiet, uneventful night shift as a janitor to turn into a nightmare. The office building was usually deserted after hours, just the way I liked it. The only sound was the gentle hum of the air conditioning and the occasional creak of the old building. That night, everything felt routine, until I heard it. A muffled bang echoed from downstairs, followed by the distinct sound of breaking glass. At first, I thought it was my imagination, but the thudding footsteps confirmed it. I wasn't alone. Curiosity got the better of me, so I cautiously made my way to the hallway, peeking around the corner toward the lobby. My heart nearly stopped when I saw them. 3 masked men, armed, rifling through the office drawers and shattering computers. My stomach twisted in fear, and my first instinct was to bolt, but I couldn't. They hadn't seen me yet, but if I made the wrong move, that could change in an instant. I backed away slowly, trying not to make a sound, but the panic was setting in. My mind raced as I considered my options. I couldn't go back downstairs. The only other way out was through the emergency exit on the roof. It seemed like a long shot, but I had no choice. I turned and sprinted up the stairs, taking 2 at a time, praying they hadn't heard me. The sound of their voices followed me as I reached the rooftop door and pushed it open. The cool night air hit me like a slap, but it did nothing to calm my nerves. I was out of sight for the moment, but the problem was far from solved. I was now trapped on the roof. The thieves would realize someone was in the building sooner or later, and I had no way down. The only neighboring building was across a gap that seemed impossibly far. As I paced the rooftop, looking for a solution, I heard the door to the stairwell creak open. My heart leapt into my throat as I ducked behind a large vent. I could hear their footsteps growing louder as they scanned the rooftop, searching for whoever had interrupted their crime. My mind was racing. What now? I couldn't stay hidden forever, and they were armed. I had to think fast. The only way out was across that gap to the other building. My stomach churned at the thought of jumping, but it was either that or face the thieves. I edged closer to the side of the roof, peering over the ledge. The gap looked wider than I'd imagined, and the drop between the 2 buildings was far enough to make my legs tremble. But there wasn't time to hesitate. I could hear them getting closer. I took a deep breath, backed up a few steps, and ran toward the ledge. For a split second, it felt like time had slowed down. My feet left the ground, and I soared through the air, the wind rushing past me. The other roof came rushing up, and I barely managed to land on my feet, stumbling forward but somehow keeping my balance. I'd made it. My heart pounded as I ducked behind an air conditioning unit, trying to steady my breath. The thieves reached the edge of the roof I'd just left, and for a terrifying moment, I thought they might follow. But they stayed where they were, scanning the area and cursing under their breath. I could see their frustration mounting, and it sent a shiver down my spine. I was safe for the moment, but it wasn't over yet. They could still find a way across, or worse, figure out how to get into the other building. Minutes passed, and they finally retreated, heading back into the building. I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. But I couldn't relax. I had to call the police, and my phone was back in the office, far out of reach. It wasn't until I noticed a distant light flashing across the street that I realized help had already arrived. A neighbor must have heard the break-in and called it in. I watched from my hiding spot as the police swarmed the building, their flashing lights illuminating the darkness. Relief washed over me, but the tension lingered. Even after the thieves were arrested and the building was declared safe, I couldn't shake the haunting memory of being hunted on that rooftop. The image of those masked men, their weapons glinting in the moonlight, stayed with me long after that night. The rooftop, once a quiet place of refuge for me during my breaks, now felt like the site of a nightmare I couldn't escape. Every time I thought about going back to work, I could still feel the cold air of the night, and hear the echo of footsteps behind me. It wasn't just the thieves that scared me. It was the feeling of being so close to danger, with nowhere to run. The fear of that night clung to me, chilling my thoughts long after the thieves were behind bars. It was supposed to be an easy night, just me, the two kids, and a quiet evening watching TV in a big, secluded house. I'd babysat for the family a few times before, and nothing unusual had ever happened. The house was remote, tucked away at the edge of a quiet neighborhood, but that had never bothered me. The parents left around 7 p.m., leaving me in charge. The kids, already tired, were in bed by 9, and the house fell into a peaceful silence. I was ready to settle in for a few hours of relaxation, but then the phone rang. At first, I assumed it was the parents calling to check in, but when I picked up, there was no one on the other end, just a long, eerie silence. I hung up, chalking it up to a wrong number, but a few minutes later, the phone rang again. This time, a voice whispered, "I can see you." My heart skipped a beat, and I quickly scanned the room, trying to stay calm. It was probably just some kid playing a prank, I told myself, but deep down I felt a creeping unease. I hung up again, but the silence in the house now felt oppressive. Every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of wind against the windows seemed magnified, as though the house itself was holding its breath. Then the phone rang for a third time. My hand shook as I answered. "Who is this?" I demanded, my voice trembling. The same voice, low and menacing, answered, "I'm closer than you think." That's when I realized it wasn't a prank. I ran to the front door, double-checking that it was locked. I checked all the windows, every room, but everything seemed secure. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The kids were sound asleep upstairs, blissfully unaware of the growing terror I felt. I didn't want to wake them unless I was sure there was a real threat. But my gut was telling me to stay on high alert. A few minutes later, I heard a noise outside. It was faint, but unmistakable. Footsteps crunching on the gravel driveway. My pulse quickened as I moved to the front window, carefully peeking out through the blinds. At first, I saw nothing but shadows cast by the moonlight. But then I spotted him, a man standing near the edge of the yard, his face obscured by the darkness. He wasn't moving, just standing there, watching the house. Panic set in, and I grabbed my phone to call the police. As I fumbled with the buttons, I heard a soft tapping at the back door. My blood ran cold. The man had moved. He was closer now. I quickly ushered the kids out of bed, trying to keep my voice steady. "We're going to play a game," I told them, forcing a smile. "We're going to hide, and you need to be really, really quiet, okay?" We huddled together in the upstairs closet, my heart pounding so hard I was sure the kids could hear it. I dialed 911. Whispering frantically into the phone, explaining the situation. They assured me help was on the way, but it would take time to get to our remote location. All I could do was wait, praying the intruder wouldn't find us. Every creak in the house felt like an omen. Every second stretched out in unbearable tension. Suddenly, we heard the unmistakable sound of glass shattering downstairs. He was inside. The kids clutched at me, their wide eyes filled with fear. I held my breath, trying to listen for his movements. The house fell deathly silent again, but we knew he was there, somewhere below us, searching. My mind raced with possible escape routes, but there was nowhere to go. We were trapped. Then, footsteps. Slow, deliberate, moving through the house, getting closer. He was heading upstairs. I could feel the blood drain from my face as the footsteps grew louder, now just outside the bedroom door. I pressed my hand over the children's mouths, hoping to stifle any sound. The doorknob rattled, and for a moment I thought the door would burst open. But then, suddenly, there was the sound of sirens in the distance. The intruder must have heard them too, because the footsteps stopped. We waited, frozen, as the sound of sirens grew louder and closer. Finally, there was a loud bang at the front door. The police had arrived. Relief flooded over me, but I didn't dare move until I heard the officers shouting downstairs, calling out for anyone in the house. Only then did I open the closet door, leading the kids downstairs to safety. The police never caught the man. By the time they searched the house and the surrounding area, he was long gone. But the fear remained. Even after the parents came home and thanked me, even after the police assured me everything was safe, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still out there, watching, waiting. Every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of wind against the windows brings me back to that night. I never took another babysitting job after that. Some nightmares cling to you, no matter how much you try to forget. It was supposed to be a peaceful retreat. After months of stress, I rented this cabin deep in the woods, hoping for some quiet and solace. At first, everything was perfect. The chirping birds, the rustling leaves, the gentle breeze through the trees. But on the third night, as I lay in bed, I heard it. Scratching. It was faint at first, but the sound crept through the walls like it was coming from something, or someone, inside. I told myself it was just the wind, or perhaps some woodland creature, but deep down, I knew it was something much more chilling. The scratching continued, and soon it was joined by a low, eerie groaning sound. By now, I was frozen, every muscle tense as I strained to hear any movement. But the silence between the noises was even worse, like the cabin itself was holding its breath. I clutched my phone, realizing there was no service. My pulse raced, my heart pounding louder than the strange noises outside. When the scratching moved closer to my room, I couldn't take it any longer. I grabbed my coat and bolted through the front door into the pouring rain. The darkness of the woods swallowed me, and I didn't dare look back. Every step I took felt like something was watching, lurking just beyond my vision, hidden in the shadows. The downpour turned the ground into a muddy mess, but nothing could slow me down. I ran as fast as my legs would carry me, branches tearing at my skin, my breath coming out in ragged gasps. Hours passed before I finally stumbled upon the old ranger's station. I collapsed on the porch, soaking wet, barely able to speak when the ranger found me. They gave me a strange look when I mentioned the cabin. I tried to explain the noises, the scratching, but the more I talked, the more they seemed concerned. That's when they told me the last person to rent that cabin had disappeared. No trace of him, not even a footprint left behind. The next day, after I regained my strength, I asked about the previous renter. The ranger hesitated before handing me an old, weathered journal. It had been found in the cabin's attic months after the man vanished. Flipping through the pages, I saw entries about the same sounds, scratching in the walls, whispers in the night. His final entry was the most haunting of all. It's inside now. There's no way out. I couldn't shake the eerie feeling as I read through his desperate words. The journal was filled with warnings. Pleas to leave, to run before it was too late. The further I read, the colder I felt, as if his terror was crawling off the pages and into my bones. I wasn't the only one who had heard those noises, and I wasn't the first to run from that cursed place. When we finally reached the bottom of the ravine, we stopped, gasping for air. The shadows had stopped moving, lingering at the edge of the trees above us. They seemed to watch us, waiting, but they didn't come any closer. We didn't sleep that night, sitting huddled together in the dark, too terrified to move. As soon as dawn broke, we hiked out of the woods, not stopping until we reached our car. We left everything behind, our tent, our supplies. None of it mattered anymore. Even now, I can't explain what we saw. The symbols carved into the trees, the shadows that followed us, none of it makes sense. But I know this. Something was out there with us. Something that didn't want us there. And whatever it was, it still haunts me. Every time I close my eyes, I can hear the footsteps in the leaves, feel the shadows watching from the trees. The strangest part, when we told the park rangers what happened, they didn't seem surprised. They asked us which part of the forest we had camped in. And when we described the location, their faces darkened. "You're lucky you got out," one of them said. "Not everyone does." That was all they said, and no matter how much I asked, they wouldn't tell me more. But the look in their eyes told me everything I needed to know. We had stumbled into something far more chilling than we could ever imagine. The symbols, the shadows, they were warnings. Warnings we were too foolish to heed. And though we escaped the forest, I can't shake the feeling that whatever was chasing us didn't stop. It's still out there, lurking, waiting for the next unlucky souls to stumble into its territory. If you ever find yourself deep in the woods and hear footsteps that don't belong, My advice is simple. Run. Run before the shadows catch you. Camping was supposed to be a relaxing escape for us, a break from the noise and chaos of the city. My partner and I set up our tent deep in the wilderness, surrounded by towering trees and the sound of nothing but nature. The first couple of nights were peaceful, just the two of us under a blanket of stars, the crackling of the fire, and the occasional call of distant wildlife. But then, on the third night, we heard something that made our blood run cold. It started with faint footsteps, crunching leaves just outside our tent. At first, we thought it was an animal, but as the footsteps grew closer, we realized it wasn't. The footsteps circled our tent, slow and deliberate. We whispered to each other, trying to stay calm, convincing ourselves it was just a deer or maybe a fox. But when the steps paused right outside the tent and a shadow fell across the fabric, we froze. Something, or someone, was out there, standing right by us. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat louder than the next. We didn't dare make a sound, holding our breath as we waited for whatever it was to move. Minutes passed, but it felt like hours. Then, just as suddenly as it came, the shadow vanished, and the footsteps faded back into the trees. We unzipped the tent cautiously, shining our flashlight around the campsite. There was nothing. No sign of anyone, no animals, just the eerie silence of the woods. We tried to shake it off, told ourselves it was just our imagination playing tricks on us. But deep down, we knew something was wrong. The woods felt different, watchful, like they were hiding something from us. The next morning, we decided to stay close to the campsite, not wanting to venture too far into the wilderness. But as we explored the area, we noticed something strange. There were symbols, carved into the trees around our campsite. Strange, intricate patterns that we couldn't make sense of. They were fresh too, as if someone had just etched them the night before. It didn't help our nerves, and the uneasy feeling only grew stronger. That night, the footsteps returned. Only this time, there were more of them. The shadows flitted between the trees, just beyond the fire's light. Every time we caught a glimpse, they disappeared, blending back into the darkness. We knew we couldn't stay there another night. We packed up our gear in a panic, our hands shaking as we stuffed everything into our backpacks. But leaving in the middle of the night wasn't easy. The forest seemed to close in around us, and the shadows, they followed. We started running. There was no other choice. The shadows moved faster now, darting between the trees, always just out of reach. My breath hitched in my throat as we stumbled down a steep ravine, barely keeping our footing. Behind us, we could hear branches snapping and leaves crunching, as if something was chasing us, getting closer and closer. I didn't dare look back, knowing that if I did, I might see something I wasn't ready to face. When we finally reached the bottom of the ravine, we stopped, gasping for air. The shadows had stopped moving, lingering at the edge of the trees above us. They seemed to watch us, waiting, but they didn't come any closer. We didn't sleep that night, sitting huddled together in the dark, too terrified to move. As soon as dawn broke, we hiked out of the woods, not stopping until we reached our car. We left everything behind. Our tent, our supplies, none of it mattered anymore. Even now, I can't explain what we saw. The symbols carved into the trees, the shadows that followed us, none of it makes sense. But I know this, something was out there with us. Something that didn't want us there. And whatever it was, it still haunts me. Every time I close my eyes, I can hear the footsteps in the leaves, feel the shadows watching from the trees. The strangest part? When we told the park rangers what happened, they didn't seem surprised. They asked us which part of the forest we had camped in, and when we described the location, their faces darkened. "You're lucky you got out," one of them said. "Not everyone does." That was all they said, and no matter how much I asked, they wouldn't tell me more. But the look in their eyes told me everything I needed to know. We had stumbled into something far more chilling than we could ever imagine. The symbols, the shadows, they were warnings. Warnings we were too foolish to heed. And though we escaped the forest, I can't shake the feeling that whatever was chasing us didn't stop. It's still out there, lurking, waiting for the next unlucky souls to stumble into its territory. If you ever find yourself deep in the woods and hear footsteps that don't belong, my advice is simple. Run. Run before the shadows catch you. It was late, and I was already exhausted from hours of driving when I spotted him. A lone hitchhiker standing on the side of the road, thumb out, with nothing but the dark highway stretching behind him. Normally, I wouldn't stop, especially not this far out in the middle of nowhere, but something made me slow down. Maybe it was the tiredness creeping in, or maybe it was just the way he looked, harmless enough with his worn backpack and disheveled appearance. Against my better judgment, I pulled over. He climbed in without a word, giving me a quick nod before settling into the passenger seat. I asked him where he was headed, and he mumbled something about wherever I can get. I didn't press. The road was long, and the silence between us stretched out, broken only by the hum of the engine. At first, everything seemed fine, though there was something off about him. His eyes kept darting around, and every now and then, he muttered under his breath. It wasn't until we were about an hour down the road that he started saying something clearer. I heard him whispering, "I have to finish the job." I glanced over, unsure if I'd heard correctly. "What job?" I asked, trying to keep my tone light, but his response sent a chill down my spine. "The job, the one I didn't finish." His voice was eerily calm, too calm for the way my heart began racing in my chest. I didn't want to provoke him, but I needed to know what he meant. "What do you mean by finish the job?" I asked, my hands gripping the steering wheel tighter. He didn't answer right away, just kept staring out the window, his fingers tapping nervously on the door. Finally, he turned to me, eyes dark and cold. "You'll find out soon enough." At that point, I knew I had made a terrible mistake. My mind raced, trying to figure out what to do next. I couldn't just stop and kick him out. What if he reacted violently? But staying on this road, trapped in the car with him, felt like a death sentence. I glanced at my phone, but of course, there was no signal this far out. The isolation of the highway, which once seemed peaceful, now felt suffocating. Then, without warning, he reached into his bag and pulled out a knife. My breath caught in my throat as I realized this was the moment he had been preparing for. "Pull over," he demanded, his voice low and threatening. I had no choice. My hands were shaking as I slowly brought the car to a stop on the side of the road, my mind spinning with ways to escape. As soon as the car stopped, he lunged at me. I don't know how I managed it, but pure adrenaline kicked in, and I fought back, grabbing his arm and wrestling with him as the blade inched closer to my throat. Somehow, I found the strength to shove him hard against the door, using my foot to kick it open. He tumbled out of the car, hitting the ground with a thud. Without hesitating, I slammed the car into gear and sped off, my hands gripping the wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. My heart pounded in my chest, each breath shaky and shallow. I didn't look back, too terrified that I might see him standing in the rearview mirror, ready to chase me down. It wasn't until I reached the next town, hours later, that I finally stopped the car and called the police. When the officers arrived, they listened intently as I described the man. One of them exchanged a look with his partner before turning back to me. "You're lucky to be alive," he said gravely. "The man you picked up is a wanted serial killer. We've been hunting him for months." The weight of his words hit me hard. I had come within inches of becoming his next victim. Later, I found out more about him through the news. He had been responsible for a string of murders across several states, always hitchhiking and attacking the unsuspecting drivers who stopped to help. The police told me I wasn't the first person he'd tried to kill, but I was one of the few who had managed to escape. That night still haunts me. The eerie calmness in his voice, the cold look in his eyes as he mentioned finishing the job. It's something I'll never forget. Every time I drive down a lonely road, I can't help but glance at the side of the highway, half expecting to see someone standing there, thumb out, waiting for their next ride. The roads may seem empty, but they hold secrets, some of which are darker than we could ever imagine. And as for hitchhikers, I've learned my lesson. No matter how harmless they may seem, you never truly know what kind of danger you're inviting into your car. Some secrets are deadly, and I came far too close to finding that out the hard way. Hiking alone always gave me a sense of peace. There's something about the stillness of nature, the solitude, the way the trees seem to absorb every sound, leaving only the soft rustle of leaves. That day, I set out on what was supposed to be a simple hike through a national park. A route I'd taken many times before. The sun was high and the air was crisp. It was the perfect day to be out in the wilderness, or so I thought. As I made my way deeper into the forest, I noticed something strange, a faint smell, like smoke or burning rubber, carried on the wind. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was probably just campers nearby, but there was something unsettling about it. A few miles in, I stumbled upon something I wasn't supposed to see, an illegal animal poaching camp. My heart sank as I spotted the crude setup, snares, traps, and skinned hides hanging from the trees. My first instinct was to back away slowly, but before I could turn around, I heard voices. Rough, angry voices. My pulse quickened, and I crouched low, hiding behind a cluster of bushes. I didn't dare breathe. Through the branches, I saw them. 2 men, armed, their faces hardened and rough. They didn't look like they were just hunting animals. The way they moved, the way they scanned the forest with their eyes, it was clear they were dangerous. I stayed crouched, hoping they wouldn't see me, but then one of them pointed in my direction. Hey, what's that? My heart stopped. I didn't wait to see if they'd noticed me. I bolted, crashing through the underbrush as fast as I could. Behind me, I could hear them shouting, their footsteps thundering after me. I was running for my life, dodging branches and roots, praying that I could lose them in the dense forest. The forest, once a peaceful retreat, had turned into a maze of terror. My legs burned and my lungs ached, but I couldn't stop. The men were gaining on me. I could hear their footsteps growing closer, their voices clearer. "Get him!" one of them yelled. I glanced over my shoulder, catching a glimpse of one of the men raising his rifle. A gunshot rang out, and I ducked, narrowly avoiding a bullet. My chest tightened with fear, but I forced myself to keep going. I reached a river, its rushing waters loud enough to drown out their voices for a moment. Without thinking, I plunged into the icy water, hoping the current would carry me far enough away from them. I waded through the river, struggling against the force of the water, every step feeling like a battle. My clothes were soaked and my muscles screamed in protest, but I kept moving, knowing that stopping would mean certain death. For hours I stayed in the river, moving along its edge, hiding whenever I could. The cold water numbed my body, but it also masked my scent, making it harder for them to track me. Occasionally I heard their voices in the distance, but they were fading. They were losing me. The adrenaline that had kept me going was beginning to wear off, and exhaustion was setting in. But I couldn't rest, not yet. As night began to fall, I found a small alcove beneath some rocks and hunkered down, hoping the cover of darkness would keep me safe. The forest was eerily quiet, and every sound made me jump. The distant hoot of an owl, the rustling of leaves in the wind, it all felt threatening now. My body was trembling, both from the cold and the fear. I didn't dare sleep. Instead, I waited, listening, hoping they had given up the hunt. Hours passed, and the sky began to lighten with the first hints of dawn. My body was stiff and sore, but I knew I had to move. Staying in one place was too risky. I emerged from my hiding spot, scanning the forest for any sign of movement. The woods were still, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I had to find help, fast. I trudged through the forest, my legs heavy with fatigue. Just as I thought I couldn't go any further, I saw him, a park ranger, walking the trail with his radio in hand. Relief washed over me as I stumbled toward him, barely able to speak. He saw the state I was in and immediately sprang into action, calling for backup and helping me to safety. Once I was safe, I told the ranger everything. The camp, the poachers, the chase. He didn't seem surprised, but his face grew grim. "You're lucky," he said. "Those guys have been causing trouble for a while now. Most people who stumble upon them don't make it out." The words hit me like a punch. I had barely escaped with my life. Even now, when I hike, I can't help but feel a sense of unease. The forest, once a place of tranquility, now feels haunted by the memory of that day. The smell of smoke, the crack of a gunshot, the feeling of being hunted, they still echo in my mind. And though I made it out, I know that deep in those woods, danger still lurks, waiting for its next unsuspecting victim. As a wildlife photographer, I've spent countless nights camping in the wilderness, always hoping to catch a rare glimpse of elusive animals. The Pacific Northwest was one of my favorite places, dense with towering trees, mist-covered mountains, and the sounds of nature echoing all around. This trip, however, felt different from the start. There was an eerie stillness in the air, as if the forest was holding its breath, waiting. I set up camp beside a stream, the quiet only broken by the occasional rustling of leaves in the wind. But as night fell, that rustling grew louder, more deliberate. At first, I brushed it off as the usual wildlife, deer, maybe a bear in the distance, but something about the sound made my skin crawl. It wasn't the typical pattern of movement you'd expect from an animal. It was slow, careful, almost as if something was watching me, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. I shined my flashlight into the trees, but the beam couldn't penetrate the dense forest. Everything beyond the campsite was cloaked in shadows. That's when I heard the growl. Low and guttural, it reverberated through the trees, shaking me to my core. My hand froze on the flashlight, the beam trembling as I scanned the darkness for the source. But the growl came from everywhere and nowhere all at once, as though the forest itself was growling. My heart raced as I stood there, rooted to the spot, every instinct screaming at me to pack up and leave. I convinced myself it was a large predator, something explainable, and decided to stay put for the night. But sleep didn't come easily. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves, jolted me awake. In the early hours of the morning, I woke to the sound of something moving closer. A large shadow flickered between the trees, barely visible, but there. I grabbed my camera, hoping to catch a glimpse of whatever it was, but the figure vanished before I could even focus. The next day, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, watching me. The forest was strangely quiet, too quiet. I packed my gear and decided to explore the area, but every step I took felt heavier, as though the very ground was warning me to turn back. I noticed strange tracks in the mud, deep, clawed prints that didn't belong to any animal I'd ever encountered. They led into the forest, deeper than I dared to follow. That night, the growling returned, louder this time, closer. I sat by the fire, camera in hand, scanning the edge of the trees. Suddenly, something large moved between the branches, just out of sight. It wasn't just an animal, it was something bigger, something more deliberate. My skin prickled as I realized this creature wasn't wandering aimlessly, it was circling me, stalking me. Panic set in. I grabbed my gear and made a run for it, abandoning my camp and heading down the narrow trail back toward the nearest ranger station, miles away. The growling followed me, always just out of sight, like an echo that grew louder with every step. Branches snapped behind me, and I could feel its presence closing in. Whatever this thing was, it was hunting me. My lungs burned as I pushed through the dense forest, my heart pounding in my ears. The growling turned into heavy footfalls, the beast's pace matching mine. I didn't dare look back, afraid that if I did, I might see something I wasn't ready to face. Every part of me screamed to run faster, but the terrain was rough, and the darkness made it hard to see more than a few feet ahead. Just when I thought I couldn't run anymore, I stumbled upon an old hunting cabin, half collapsed and overgrown. I darted inside, slamming the door behind me. The creature growled again, right outside, pacing around the cabin like it was testing the structure's weaknesses. I barricaded the door with what little furniture I could find and crouched in the corner, clutching my camera like a lifeline. For hours, I sat there, listening as the creature circled the cabin, scratching at the walls and growling lowly. I knew it was only a matter of time before it found a way inside. My mind raced, trying to figure out a way to survive. But just as the sun began to rise, the growling stopped. I waited, heart pounding, until I was sure it was gone. The forest was eerily quiet once more. When I finally worked up the courage to leave the cabin, I found my campsite completely destroyed. My tent was shredded, my gear scattered, and deep claw marks were carved into the trees around where I had been sleeping. Whatever had stalked me through the forest had left its mark, and it wasn't just any animal. It was something far more dangerous, something that shouldn't exist. I reported the encounter to the local authorities, but they didn't believe me. They chalked it up to a bear attack, despite the strange tracks and the destruction that didn't match any known predator. I left the forest that day, but the experience still haunts me. I can't forget the growling, the feeling of being watched, or the shadow that followed me through the trees. Even now, when I'm deep in the woods, I can feel its presence lurking just beyond the edge of my sight. The Pacific Northwest is full of untamed wilderness, but some things that roam those forests are far more chilling and eerie than we're prepared to face. And whatever was stalking me that night, it's still. Working the night shift as a janitor in a nearly empty office building always had its perks: peace and quiet, and the freedom to move around without anyone in the way. But that night, something felt off the moment I walked in. The building had the same dim lighting and familiar hum of electronics, yet there was a strange tension in the air that made me uneasy. I shrugged it off, assuming it was just my imagination playing tricks on me after so many late nights. I was wrong. I had just finished cleaning the first floor when I heard it. A faint sound, like the shuffle of footsteps echoing down the hallway. At first, I thought it was just someone working late, but as I moved closer, the sound grew louder and more erratic, like someone was moving quickly, trying to stay unnoticed. My heart started racing. No one was supposed to be here, and the building had already been locked for the night. As I peered down the hallway, I saw them. 3 men, all dressed in dark clothing and wearing ski masks, were moving through the office with alarming speed. They weren't just late-night workers, they were burglars. My stomach dropped as I ducked behind a cubicle, trying to stay out of sight. The adrenaline hit me like a jolt of electricity, and I knew I had to act fast. But what could I do? I was outnumbered and unarmed. I pulled out my phone, but of course, there was no signal in the building's lower levels. My mind raced as I thought of my options. The only way out was through the emergency exit, but that meant crossing the open space where the burglars were still prowling. I could hear them talking in low voices, and the clatter of drawers being pulled open as they rummaged through the office. They were looking for something. Cash, valuable electronics, who knew what else? But I knew they wouldn't take kindly to a witness. I stayed hidden, waiting for the right moment to make my move. But as I crouched there, I heard a loud crash. One of the men had knocked over a computer monitor, and the sound echoed through the building like a gunshot. I flinched, and in that split second, one of them looked in my direction. Our eyes locked. My blood ran cold. Without thinking, I bolted down the hallway toward the stairs, my heart pounding in my ears. The sound of footsteps thundered behind me as they chased after me, their shouts growing louder with each step. I ran as fast as I could, the soles of my shoes slapping against the linoleum floor, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I could hear them getting closer, but I didn't dare look back. I pushed through the stairwell door, taking the steps 2 at a time, heading toward the roof. It was my only chance. Reaching the top, I burst through the door to the rooftop, the cool night air hitting me like a wave of relief. But my relief was short-lived. I was trapped. The only way off the roof was to make a dangerous leap to the adjacent building. The gap wasn't huge, but it was far enough to make my stomach churn with fear. The shouts from the stairwell grew louder. There was no time to think. I backed up, took a deep breath, and sprinted toward the edge. For a brief moment, everything felt suspended, like I was floating in midair. Then I hit the roof of the neighboring building, hard. I rolled, barely keeping my balance, but I was alive. Behind me, I could hear the burglars cursing as they reached the rooftop and realized I'd made it across. They wouldn't dare follow, at least not yet. I scrambled to my feet, scanning the other building for a way down. That's when I saw it, an old emergency ladder, bolted to the side of the building, rusty but still intact. I rushed over, grabbed hold of the ladder, and began my descent, my hands shaking with a mix of adrenaline and fear. Halfway down, I heard the burglars arguing on the rooftop, their voices filled with frustration. They weren't going to jump, but they weren't giving up either. As soon as I hit the ground, I ran. I didn't stop until I reached a nearby gas station, where I finally called the police. It felt like hours had passed before they arrived, but it was probably only minutes. I explained everything to the officers, my voice still shaking from the adrenaline. They rushed to the office building, and after a tense standoff, the burglars were caught. But even as they were led away in handcuffs, I couldn't shake the haunting feeling that lingered. The building was quiet again, but it would never feel the same. The place that once felt like a peaceful escape from the world now felt eerie, haunted by the memory of that night. Every time I walk into the office, I can't help but glance over my shoulder, half expecting to see those masked men lurking in the shadows. I still work the night shift, but I'm always on edge, every small sound making my heart race. The thieves may be behind bars, but the fear they left behind hasn't gone anywhere. It lingers in the air, chilling and haunting, like an unwelcome presence that refuses to leave. It was a routine babysitting job, just a quiet night in with 2 kids while their parents went out for dinner. I'd been there before, so I knew the house well. It was an old place, big and somewhat isolated, sitting at the edge of a thick patch of woods. The family was nice, and the kids were easy to handle. After putting them to bed, I settled in on the couch to watch TV, unaware that the night was about to take a chilling turn. About an hour into the evening, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. The message was simple but unsettling. "I'm watching you." I frowned, thinking it must be a prank. I'd heard of babysitters getting random creepy texts before, and I figured this was just another case of that. I ignored it and went back to watching TV, trying to push the thought out of my mind. But a few minutes later, another message came through. "I see you on the couch." This one rattled me. I sat up straight, my eyes darting to the windows. The curtains were drawn, but the unease settled deep in my chest. Was someone really outside? I stood up and checked the locks on the doors, all of which were secure. The house was quiet, too quiet. The kids were asleep upstairs, and I didn't want to wake them unless I was certain something was wrong. I told myself it was just a prank, someone messing with me. Another text buzzed in. "Go ahead, check the back door." My blood ran cold. Whoever it was knew I was moving through the house, checking the locks. I hesitated, but slowly made my way to the back door. My heart was racing, and when I peeked through the blinds, my worst fear was confirmed. A shadowy figure stood just beyond the porch, barely visible under the dim porch light. He wasn't moving, just standing there, watching. Panic surged through me. I locked the back door and grabbed my phone, dialing 911 with trembling hands. I tried to stay calm as I explained the situation to the operator, but my voice was shaky. "There's someone outside," I whispered, glancing at the window again. The figure hadn't moved. The operator assured me the police were on their way, but I knew it would take time for them to arrive. Time I wasn't sure I had. Then I heard it. A soft tapping on the back door. My heart felt like it might burst from my chest as the tapping grew louder, more insistent. I ran upstairs to check on the kids, finding them fast asleep, blissfully unaware of the growing terror downstairs. I had to keep them safe, no matter what. I hurried them into a closet, whispering that we were playing a game, trying to keep the fear out of my voice. Another text came through. "You can't hide from me." My breath hitched. I knew the intruder was getting bolder. I grabbed a chair and jammed it under the doorknob, trying to barricade the door. The tapping turned into pounding, and I could hear the man's footsteps moving around the house. He was testing the doors, trying to find a way in. Every second that passed felt like an eternity, and I was praying the police would arrive soon. Suddenly, there was the sound of breaking glass. He was inside the house. My stomach dropped as I heard him moving through the kitchen, his footsteps slow and deliberate, as if he was taking his time. I held my breath, clutching my phone, but there was no time to call again. I had to focus on keeping the kids safe. I could hear him coming closer, his footsteps echoing in the hallway outside the bedroom. Then, The doorknob rattled. My heart raced as I pressed my back against the closet door, holding it shut as best as I could. The kids were completely silent, sensing the danger. The rattling grew more forceful, and I knew it was only a matter of time before he broke through. My mind raced, trying to come up with a plan, but there was nowhere to go. Just as the door began to creak under the pressure, I heard the distant wail of sirens. The intruder must have heard them too, because suddenly, the rattling stopped. His footsteps retreated down the hall, and within seconds, I heard him crashing through the house, fleeing into the night. I didn't move until the police knocked on the front door, their voices calling out as they entered the house. When I opened the closet door, I felt a wave of relief, but the fear still clung to me like a shadow. The police searched the property but found no sign of the man. He had vanished into the woods, leaving behind nothing but broken glass and the echo of his footsteps in the house. The family was shaken when they returned, horrified by how close the night had come to ending in tragedy. The police never caught the man. They believed he was a stalker, someone who had been watching the house for days, waiting for the right moment to strike. Even after the incident, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting. The texts stopped, but the memory of that night never did. Now every time I babysit, I find myself checking the windows, locking the doors, and listening for any sound that might signal something or someone dangerous. The feeling of being watched, of being hunted, has never fully gone away. It lingers, chilling and haunting, long after the night has ended. Hiking in the remote mountain ranges had always been my escape from the chaos of life. I loved the feeling of being alone with my thoughts, surrounded by nothing but nature. That morning, the sky was clear and the air was crisp as I set off on a solo trek through a trail that few people ever took. It was peaceful, just me and the mountains, and I felt completely at ease. But as the day wore on, the weather started to change. Dark clouds rolled in and the wind picked up, signaling an approaching storm. I quickened my pace, hoping to make it to the next ridge before the weather turned. The path became narrower, with steep cliffs on either side, and I could feel the air growing heavier. Then, out of nowhere, I heard it. A low rumble that vibrated through the ground beneath me. At first, I thought it was thunder, but the sound grew louder and more violent. I stopped in my tracks, my heart pounding as the earth beneath my feet began to shake. Before I had time to react, the side of the mountain gave way. Rocks and dirt tumbled down the slope in a massive landslide, and I was caught right in the middle of it. I tried to run, but the ground beneath me crumbled and I lost my footing. My leg got pinned under a heavy rock as debris piled on top of me. Pain shot through my body and I realized I was trapped, unable to move. Panic set in as I struggled to free myself, but it was no use. The rocks were too heavy and I was stuck. As the dust settled, the reality of my situation hit me. I was pinned in the middle of nowhere, with no phone signal and no one around to help. The storm was closing in, and the sky had turned a deep, ominous gray. My supplies were scattered around me, just out of reach. The cold began to seep into my bones, and I knew that if I didn't get out soon, things could turn deadly. The pain in my leg was unbearable, but I couldn't focus on that. I had to figure out how to survive. The minutes felt like hours as I tried to calm myself and assess the situation. I could hear the distant roll of thunder, but it was the sound closer to me that made my blood run cold. A strange, guttural noise, like something was lurking nearby. My heart raced as I strained to listen, convinced that whatever was making that noise was getting closer. It didn't sound like any animal I had ever heard. It was deep, menacing, and unnatural. I scanned the area, but there was nothing to see beyond the rocks and trees. Still, the noise persisted, growing louder and more distinct. I couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone was out there, watching me. I was vulnerable, trapped, and completely alone. My mind raced with possibilities, each one more terrifying than the last. Was it a wild animal, drawn by the scent of blood from my injury? Or was it something worse, something I couldn't even comprehend? As night began to fall, the temperature dropped, and the darkness closed in around me. The only sound now was the eerie howl of the wind through the trees and that strange, low growl that seemed to echo off the mountains. I knew I had to free myself, but every time I tried to move, the pain in my leg was excruciating. The rocks felt heavier with each attempt, and my strength was fading. I was running out of options. With no other choice, I decided to try and dig myself out. I clawed at the dirt around the rock that pinned my leg, using my hands to scrape away at the earth. It was slow, painful work, but I had no other choice. The growling in the distance grew louder, more insistent, and I could feel my nerves unraveling. My mind was screaming at me to move faster, to get free before whatever was out there came any closer. After what felt like an eternity, I finally managed to loosen the rock just enough to pull my leg free. The pain was blinding, but I forced myself to stand, leaning heavily on a nearby tree for support. My leg was badly injured, but I was mobile. I grabbed what supplies I could reach and hobbled away from the site, my eyes scanning the trees for any sign of movement. The growling had stopped, but I knew better than to assume I was safe. The storm hit in full force as I made my way back toward the trailhead, lightning flashing overhead and rain pouring down in sheets. I pushed through the pain and the cold, my heart pounding with every step, every shadow in the trees, making me jump. I didn't know what had been watching me, but I wasn't going to stick around to find out. The only thing on my mind was getting out of the wilderness alive. By the time I reached the trailhead, I was soaked, exhausted, and barely able to stand. A ranger found me the next morning, half delirious from pain and exposure, but alive. I told him about the landslide, about being trapped, but I couldn't bring myself to mention the growling, the feeling of being hunted. It felt too unreal, too eerie to explain. But I know what I heard. Even now, as I recover, I can't shake the memory of that night. The feeling of being trapped, helpless, and hunted in the wilderness lingers with me. The mountains, once a place of peace, now feel like a haunted, dangerous place. And whatever was out there that night, I hope I never encounter it again. I had rented the secluded cabin to escape the noise of the city, hoping for some peace and quiet to finish my writing. Nestled deep in the woods, the cabin was everything I had imagined. Rustic, isolated, and completely tranquil. The nearest town was miles away, and there was no phone signal. It felt like the perfect retreat for a few days of uninterrupted creativity. When I arrived, I was thrilled by the stillness that surrounded the place. The first day passed peacefully, and by evening, I had made significant progress on my manuscript. The next morning, I decided to go for a hike to clear my head. The woods around the cabin were dense and dark, but the trail was easy to follow, winding through towering trees and alongside a small creek. After a few hours, I returned to the cabin, my legs tired but my mind refreshed. But as I approached the front door, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. The door was slightly ajar. I distinctly remembered locking it before I left. A chill ran down my spine as I stood there, staring at the door. For a moment, I considered the possibility that I had simply forgotten to lock it. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. I took a deep breath, pushing the door open wider and stepping inside. The cabin was eerily quiet, just as I had left it, but something felt off. My heart raced as I scanned the room, searching for any signs that someone had been inside. Nothing seemed out of place at first, but the atmosphere in the cabin felt different, heavier, almost oppressive. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. My mind raced as I checked the windows and other doors, all of which were locked from the inside. If someone had been here, they hadn't left the usual signs. No broken glass, no disturbed furniture. Still, I couldn't relax. I locked the front door again and bolted it, making sure it was secure this time. That night, the unease settled deep in my bones. I tried to focus on my writing, but every little creak and groan of the old cabin made me jump. The wind howled through the trees, rattling the windows, and in the distance I could hear branches snapping. At first, I convinced myself it was just the wind, or maybe an animal moving through the woods. But as the hours passed, the sounds grew louder, more deliberate. It wasn't the wind, and it wasn't an animal. Footsteps. They were faint but unmistakable, crunching on the gravel outside the cabin. My breath caught in my throat as I turned off the lights, peering through the curtains. The night was pitch black, and I couldn't see anything beyond the narrow beam of the porch light. But I knew someone, or something, was out there. The footsteps stopped right outside the door, and I felt my heart hammering in my chest. I grabbed my phone, but there was no signal. My only option was to stay quiet and hope whoever was outside would leave. Minutes passed, stretching into what felt like hours. Then, I heard the soft creak of the porch steps. My blood ran cold. Whoever it was, they were getting closer. I backed away from the door, searching for something. Anything I could use as a weapon. My eyes landed on a heavy fireplace poker, and I grabbed it, my hands trembling. Just as I positioned myself by the bedroom door, there was a knock. A soft, slow knock, as if whoever was outside knew I was there and was waiting for me to answer. I stayed perfectly still, my knuckles white around the handle of the poker. Another knock, this time louder, more insistent. I could hear my own heartbeat thudding in my ears, and every fiber of my being screamed at me not to open that door. Suddenly, the doorknob rattled. My breath caught as the door shook, as though someone was trying to force it open. I stood frozen, every muscle tensed, waiting for it to burst open at any moment. But then, just as suddenly as it had started, the rattling stopped. Silence fell over the cabin once again, but I couldn't move. I didn't dare breathe. The only sound was the wind outside, whistling through the trees. Eventually, I gathered the courage to peek through the curtains again. The porch was empty. There was no sign of anyone. No footprints, no shadows, just the eerie stillness of the night. I tried to convince myself that I had imagined it, that the wind had played tricks on me, but I knew better. Something had been there, and it wasn't just the wind. The next morning, I found it. A single bloody handprint, smeared on the window next to the door. My stomach churned as I stared at it, my mind racing with fear. Whoever had been outside the cabin hadn't just knocked. They had been watching, waiting. I packed my things as quickly as I could and left the cabin, driving away without looking back. To this day, I still don't know who or what was outside that night. But every time I think about it, a chill runs down my spine. That handprint, that soft knock, the feeling of being watched, it stays with me, haunting my thoughts. I haven't been back to that cabin, and I never will. Some places once touched by something so eerie and chilling are better left alone. It was a long drive home. One of those endless stretches of highway where it feels like the night is swallowing you whole. The road was empty, and the only thing keeping me company was the hum of my car engine and the faint light of the moon hanging over the horizon. I'd been on the road for hours, and fatigue was starting to creep in. The occasional passing truck or distant headlights were my only reminders that I wasn't completely alone out there. That's when I noticed the car behind me. At first, it seemed harmless, just another vehicle on the highway. But after a few minutes, I realized it wasn't just following me, it was tailgating me, too close for comfort. The headlights flashed, and the driver honked, signaling for me to pull over. My heart rate spiked as a sense of unease settled in. Something about the way they were driving didn't feel right. It wasn't aggressive enough to be road rage, but it was deliberate, as if they wanted something from me. I glanced at my phone. No signal. Typical on a road this remote. My mind raced through my options, but there weren't many. The last exit had been miles back, and the next one wasn't for another stretch. I tried to stay calm, hoping the car would just pass me and be on its way. But it didn't. Instead, it flashed its high beams again, this time more urgently. I could feel my anxiety rising, a knot tightening in my stomach. With no other choice, I eased off the gas and pulled onto the shoulder, my pulse pounding in my ears. The car slowed behind me, pulling over as well. A wave of dread washed over me as I watched the driver's door open. The man who stepped out was tall, his figure barely visible in the dim glow of his headlights. My heart raced faster as he began walking toward my car. Something about him didn't sit right with me. His movements were too calm, too calculated. I cracked my window just enough to hear him. "Everything okay?" he called out, his voice flat, almost mechanical. I forced a smile and nodded, trying to appear calm even though I could feel the fear clawing at me from the inside. "Yeah, I'm fine, just taking a break," I replied, my voice trembling slightly. He didn't move for a moment, just stood there staring at me. Then, slowly, a smile crept across his face, a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Something wasn't right. My instincts screamed at me to drive, to get out of there as fast as possible, but my hands were frozen on the steering wheel. The man took another step closer, and that's when I saw it. The glint of metal in his hand. A knife. My blood ran cold. Without another thought, I slammed my foot on the gas, the tires screeching as I sped away from the shoulder and back onto the highway. In my rearview mirror, I saw the man pause for a second, then run back to his car. Panic surged through me as his headlights appeared in my rearview mirror once again, this time closing in fast. He was chasing me. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white. I pushed the car as fast as it would go, weaving between lanes, but he was relentless, matching my speed. The narrow, empty highway suddenly felt like a trap, with no exits in sight and no way to call for help. My mind raced, trying to come up with a plan. I knew I couldn't outrun him forever, but I had to do something. I spotted a narrow dirt road branching off the highway up ahead. Without hesitating, I jerked the wheel and veered off onto the road, kicking up dust as my car bounced over the uneven terrain. The road was rough, but I didn't care. I just needed to lose him. For a moment, I thought I had done it. The car behind me disappeared in a cloud of dust, and the only sound was the rattling of my engine as I sped down the narrow dirt path. But then, in the distance, I saw his headlights again. He had followed me onto the road. My heart sank as I realized he wasn't going to stop. This wasn't just a random encounter. He had been hunting me. The road twisted and turned through the dense woods, branches scraping the sides of my car as I sped along. I didn't know where I was going, but I couldn't slow down. Every second, those headlights grew closer, the gap between us shrinking. Then, out of nowhere, the road opened up into a clearing. At the far end, I saw it, a small, run-down gas station with a single flickering light. I floored the gas pedal, racing toward the station. As I pulled in, I spotted an old man inside, sitting behind the counter. I jumped out of my car and ran inside, breathless and terrified. "Call the police!" I shouted, slamming the door behind me. The old man looked up, startled, but he didn't question me. He grabbed the phone and dialed as I frantically looked out the window. The man in the car had stopped at the edge of the clearing, his headlights illuminating the gas station. For a moment, we stood there, staring at each other through the glass. He didn't get out of the car. He just sat there, watching me. Then, as the sound of sirens approached in the distance, he slowly backed up, turned around, and disappeared into the night. My knees buckled as the adrenaline drained from my body, leaving me trembling and exhausted. The police arrived a few minutes later, but by then, the man was long gone. They searched the area but found no trace of him or his car. It was as if he had vanished into the dark, leaving nothing behind but the lingering terror of that night. Even now, whenever I drive down an empty highway, I can't help but glance in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see those headlights again. I'd always liked the peace and quiet of rural life, and house-sitting for my friend at her farmhouse seemed like the perfect getaway. Nestled in the middle of nowhere, with acres of fields and woods around it, the house was charmingly isolated. The nights were silent, save for the occasional chirp of crickets or the wind rustling through the trees. It was exactly what I needed after weeks of stress. The first couple of nights passed without a hitch. Just me, a good book, and the open space. But on the third night, I was jolted awake by a loud crash downstairs. My heart raced as I sat up in bed, straining to listen in the dark. The sound wasn't something that could be easily explained away. It wasn't the wind, and it certainly wasn't an animal. It had been deliberate, like glass shattering. I grabbed my phone and saw that there was no signal, something I had grown used to out here. I was alone. I crept out of bed, the floorboards creaking under my feet as I made my way toward the staircase. My mind raced through every possibility. Maybe something had fallen, or maybe it was just my imagination running wild. But when I reached the bottom of the stairs, the chill that ran through me confirmed my worst fear. The front window had been smashed. Shards of glass scattered across the floor. I froze in place, my breath catching in my throat. Someone was in the house. My pulse quickened as I scanned the room, but there was no one in sight. I could feel my hands shaking as I reached for the nearest object I could find, a fire poker from beside the hearth. Clutching it tightly, I moved slowly through the house, every shadow in the dim light making my heart race. The silence was deafening, but I could feel someone's presence, lurking just out of sight. I checked the doors, and all of them were still locked from the inside. Whoever had broken in was still in the house. My mind screamed at me to get out, but there was nowhere to run. The nearest neighbors were miles away, and the isolation that had once been comforting now felt like a trap. As I stood there trying to decide what to do, I heard it. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from the kitchen. The realization hit me hard. The intruder was still here, somewhere in the house, moving closer. Panic surged through me, and I backed away from the sound, my grip on the fire poker tightening. I needed to hide. I needed to keep quiet. I darted up the stairs as silently as I could, slipping into the guest bedroom and locking the door behind me. My heart was pounding in my chest as I crouched down in the closet, praying that whoever was downstairs wouldn't come looking for me. The footsteps moved through the house, heavy and slow, as if the intruder was taking their time, searching. I held my breath, trying to stay as still as possible, but every creak of the floor made me flinch. I could hear drawers being opened and closed, furniture being moved, but I had no idea what they were looking for. My mind raced through every worst-case scenario, and with no phone signal and no way out, I felt completely trapped. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours, the tension growing unbearable. The footsteps finally stopped, and for a moment the house was eerily quiet. Then, I heard the faint creak of the stairs. My stomach dropped. The intruder was coming upstairs. My mind raced. There was nowhere to go, nowhere to hide. The door rattled slightly, as though they were testing it, and I braced myself for the worst. Just as I thought they would break through, I heard something. Sirens. Faint at first, but growing louder. I had forgotten that there was a security system installed, one that called the local authorities if the window sensors were triggered. The sound of the sirens grew closer, and the footsteps outside the door retreated. The intruder must have heard them too, because within seconds, I heard the sound of hurried footsteps running down the stairs and out through the shattered window. I stayed hidden in the closet until I heard the police shouting from downstairs. When I finally emerged, I was shaking, still clutching the fire poker. The police found nothing but broken glass and a few overturned drawers. Whoever had been in the house had vanished into the night, leaving no trace behind. But the fear they left behind lingered. As I spoke with the officers, I learned that a man had escaped from a nearby prison just a few days earlier. They suspected he had been hiding in the woods, looking for shelter. The thought that he had been in the same house as me, possibly searching for something more than just a place to hide, sent a chill down my spine. Even after I left the farmhouse and returned to the city, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The house, once a peaceful retreat, now felt like a place of nightmares. Every night I would hear the sound of breaking glass in my mind, reliving the moment over and over. And although the police assured me they would catch him, a part of me knew he was still out there, somewhere in the dark. The cabin by the lake had always been my favorite place to unwind. It was the perfect escape from the chaos of daily life, surrounded by serene waters and towering trees. My partner and I had planned a relaxing weekend there, far from the city's noise. When we arrived, the sky was overcast, and a soft drizzle had already begun, but we didn't think much of it. The weather forecast warned of rain, but nothing that seemed too concerning. We settled in, lighting a fire and enjoying the quiet isolation. By the second day, the drizzle had turned into a torrential downpour. The rain hammered against the cabin's roof, and the wind howled through the trees, bending them in unnatural ways. The lake, usually calm and inviting, had become a swirling mass of dark water, its waves crashing violently against the shore. The water level was rising fast. It wasn't long before the edge of the lake was only a few feet from the cabin's porch. Unease began to settle in, but we convinced ourselves that the storm would pass soon. Late that evening, as the storm raged on, there was a frantic knocking at the door. The sound startled us both. It was late, and we hadn't seen another person for miles since we arrived. I approached the door cautiously, peering through the rain-soaked window. A man stood on the porch, drenched to the bone, his face hidden under a hood. He was shouting something, but the sound of the wind and rain made it impossible to hear. Against my better judgment, I opened the door just a crack. "Please, let me in," the man begged, his voice frantic. "My car broke down and the water's rising fast. I need shelter." My partner and I exchanged a glance, unsure of what to do. Something about the man felt off. His eyes darted around nervously, and he seemed far too calm, considering the storm outside. Still, we couldn't just leave him out there in the storm. Reluctantly, we let him inside. As the man entered, dripping water all over the floor, I couldn't shake the eerie feeling that something was wrong. He didn't ask for anything. No towel, no warmth from the fire. He just stood there, staring out the window, as if waiting for something. I tried to make small talk, asking where his car was, but his answers were vague, evasive. That's when I noticed something else. Muddy footprints leading from the porch, back into the woods. He hadn't come from the road. My stomach twisted with fear. I whispered to my partner, telling them about the footprints, and we both became increasingly uneasy. The storm outside was getting worse, and the cabin felt like it was shrinking around us, closing in. Just as we were about to confront the man, there was another knock at the door. Louder this time, more forceful. I rushed to the window, pulling back the curtain just enough to see outside. My heart nearly stopped. There were more of them. Figures, at least 3, maybe 4, standing just beyond the porch in the downpour. Their faces were obscured by the rain and darkness, but their intentions were clear. They were waiting, and the man we had let inside, he was part of it. "We need to leave," my partner whispered, their voice barely audible over the storm. Panic set in as I realized we were trapped. The water around the cabin had risen even higher, flooding the yard and surrounding the building. There was no way to drive out, and the figures outside showed no sign of leaving. The man inside stood by the window, watching us closely now, his eyes cold and calculating. Desperate, we locked ourselves in the bedroom, barricading the door with whatever we could find. We could hear the man pacing outside, his footsteps slow and deliberate. The knocking continued, growing more insistent with each passing minute. The rain hammered against the walls, and the water began to seep through the cracks in the floorboards. We were running out of time. The power flickered, and the lights went out, plunging us into complete darkness. The sound of the storm outside was deafening, but I could still hear the faint tapping at the windows, the soft scratching of something, or someone, trying to get in. My partner and I huddled together, our breath shallow, as the water began to pool at our feet. Suddenly, there was a loud crash as the front door burst open. We heard the man's voice, shouting something to the others outside. They were inside the cabin now, moving through the rooms, their footsteps sloshing through the rising water. We held our breath, trying to stay as quiet as possible, but the water level was climbing fast, and we knew we couldn't stay hidden much longer. Just as they reached the bedroom door, there was a blinding flash of light. For a moment, I thought it was lightning, but then I realized it was headlights. The sound of an engine roared through the storm, and the figures outside froze. Someone had arrived. The men inside the cabin fled in an instant, disappearing into the night. We didn't wait to see who had come to our rescue. We waded through the water and climbed onto the roof, where a rescue boat from the nearby town had pulled up, its lights cutting through the darkness. We were saved, but the fear lingered. Even after we were safe in town, the memory of that night haunted us. Who were those people? What did they want? And why had they chosen our cabin during the storm? We'll never know. The floodwaters receded, but the eerie feeling that had settled over that cabin remains, chilling and haunting, long after the storm passed. Hiking solo was something I'd always enjoyed. There was a certain serenity in being alone with nature, the wind whispering through the trees, and the sound of my footsteps echoing off the canyon walls. This particular canyon was remote, the kind of place where you don't see another soul for miles, and that was exactly why I loved it. The trail was challenging but manageable, and the views from the top were supposed to be breathtaking. I was halfway through my hike when the first storm clouds rolled in, sudden and unexpected. The wind picked up and the sky darkened quickly. Before I knew it, I was caught in a downpour, the rain lashing against the canyon walls and turning the dirt path into slippery mud. I pulled my jacket tighter around me, trying to push through. I'd come too far to turn back now. But as I pressed on, something strange began to happen. The sound of the rain seemed to distort, as if it wasn't just the storm making noise. There were footsteps, faint at first but unmistakable, following me. At first I told myself it was just my imagination, the sound of the rain bouncing off the walls, but the footsteps were too distinct, too rhythmic, matching my own pace. I stopped to listen, heart pounding, but all I could hear was the rain. When I started walking again, the footsteps returned. This time, they were louder, closer. My heart raced as I glanced around, but the canyon was empty. No one was supposed to be out here. I was completely alone, wasn't I? As I hurried along the trail, my unease grew. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone, but the path behind me was empty. Still, the feeling of being watched clung to me, chilling and unsettling. The storm intensified, and the canyon began to feel less like a place of beauty and more like a trap. The walls seemed to close in, and every twist in the path felt like it was leading me deeper into something I couldn't escape. Then I saw it, just out of the corner of my eye. A shadow, darting between the rocks, gone in an instant. My heart skipped a beat as I turned to look, but there was nothing there. I told myself it was just the storm playing tricks on my mind, but the dread in my chest told me otherwise. Something, or someone, was out there, just out of sight, watching me. The canyon was growing darker as the storm clouds thickened. My pace quickened, but the terrain was rough, and I had to watch my step on the slick, uneven ground. Still, the footsteps echoed behind me, closer now, relentless. I wasn't imagining it anymore. Someone was following me, stalking me through the canyon. Every hair on my body stood on end as I tried to calculate my options. The trail ahead curved sharply, and I knew I needed to get out of sight. I ducked behind a large rock formation, crouching low and holding my breath. The footsteps stopped. For a few agonizing minutes, all I could hear was the wind and rain. But then, there it was again. The unmistakable crunch of gravel underfoot, slow and deliberate. Whoever it was, they were close now, just around the corner. I could feel my pulse in my throat, fear coursing through my veins as I tried to stay as still as possible. The rain poured harder, drenching me as I waited in silence. I didn't dare move, didn't dare peek around the rock. The footsteps paused for a moment, right where I had been standing just moments before. My heart pounded so loudly I was sure whoever was out there could hear it. I could feel the weight of their presence, the sense that they were searching, hunting. But then, after what felt like an eternity, the footsteps slowly moved on, continuing down the path. I waited until the footsteps faded before I dared to move. My legs were trembling, but I had to keep going. I needed to get out of the canyon before nightfall. As I continued along the trail, my mind raced. Who was following me? And why? Were they still out there, watching from the shadows, waiting for another chance to close in? I couldn't shake the feeling of being hunted. Just as the path began to ascend out of the canyon, I heard the footsteps again, closer this time, faster. Panic surged through me, and I broke into a run, my feet slipping on the wet ground as I scrambled up the rocky slope. I didn't look back. I couldn't. The only thing that mattered was getting out. The sound of the footsteps behind me grew louder, more frantic, like they were trying to catch up. By the time I reached the top of the canyon, I was breathless and soaked to the bone. The rain had eased, but the sky was still dark. I glanced behind me one last time, expecting to see my pursuer emerging from the shadows. But the canyon was empty. The path behind me was clear, no sign of anyone or anything following. But the feeling of being watched remained, chilling and haunting. Even now, I can't explain what happened that day. I never saw anyone, and there was no evidence that I wasn't alone. But I know what I heard, what I felt. Something or someone had been stalking me through that canyon, and I was lucky to have made it out. Every time I think about returning to the wilderness, the memory of those footsteps echoes in my mind, reminding me that sometimes the most terrifying things are the ones you can't see. The skies were clear when I first set out on my drive through rural Oklahoma. I had the radio turned low, the open road ahead of me stretching for miles. The forecast had mentioned storms later in the evening, but nothing out of the ordinary for this part of the country. Still, something about the air felt heavy, oppressive. It was the kind of day where you could sense a change coming, even before the clouds started to gather. A couple of hours into the drive, the wind picked up and dark clouds began to roll across the horizon. Within minutes, the sky turned from bright blue to an ominous shade of gray. I'd driven through plenty of storms before, but this one felt different, more urgent. The wind howled, bending the tall grass along the road, and lightning began to flash in the distance. Then, out of nowhere, the weather alert came through my radio. A tornado warning had been issued for the area. Panic surged through me as the rain began to fall in thick sheets, pounding against my windshield. I could barely see the road in front of me, and the wind was making it difficult to keep the car steady. I scanned the horizon for any sign of a safe place to take cover, but there was nothing. No buildings, no exits, just open fields and the occasional patch of trees. That's when I saw it. The dark, swirling funnel in the distance, moving toward me faster than I could have imagined. I knew I had to get off the road. The only structure I could see was an old barn, standing alone in the middle of a field just off the highway. I swerved off the road, my tires skidding in the mud as I made my way toward the barn. The tornado was closing in, the roar of the wind growing louder with each passing second. I pulled up to the barn, jumped out of the car, and ran inside, slamming the door behind me. The barn was dark and musty, with broken windows and walls that creaked under the force of the wind. I barely had time to catch my breath before I realized I wasn't alone. In the far corner of the barn, a man stood, his back to me, clutching a rifle. His clothes were ragged, and his posture was tense. My stomach twisted with fear as I took a step back, trying to decide what to do. He hadn't noticed me yet, but the storm outside was growing more violent by the second, and there was nowhere else to go. Before I could make a decision, the man turned around, his eyes wild and frantic. "You shouldn't have come here," he muttered, his voice barely audible over the roar of the wind. I froze, unsure of what he meant. The tornado was bearing down on us, and the barn rattled as if it might be ripped apart at any moment. But the man didn't seem concerned about the storm. He was focused on me. I tried to explain that I had no choice, that I was just looking for shelter, but he wasn't listening. He raised the rifle, his hands trembling, and took a step toward me. My heart raced as I backed away, my mind scrambling for a way out. The storm outside was deafening now, the sound of the wind like a freight train barreling toward us. The barn shook violently, and debris started to fly through the air. But the man didn't flinch. The wind howled, and the barn's roof began to peel away, leaving us exposed to the elements. I could feel the pressure in the air change, the unmistakable presence of the tornado right outside. My instincts kicked in, and I made a run for it, ducking behind a pile of old crates, just as the man fired the rifle. The shot rang out, but I didn't stop. I scrambled to the far side of the barn, searching for any place to hide, any way to survive both the storm and the man who was clearly not thinking rationally. Suddenly, the barn door blew open, and the full force of the tornado hit. The wind knocked me off my feet, sending me crashing into a wall as debris flew through the air. The man yelled something, but his voice was lost in the chaos. I could barely see through the dust and debris swirling around me. The tornado was tearing the barn apart piece by piece, and I knew I didn't have much time before the entire structure came down. I crawled toward a small opening in the back of the barn, where the walls were still intact. Just as I reached it, I heard the man shout again, closer this time. He was coming after me. I looked back and saw him struggling to keep his footing, the rifle still clutched in his hands. I didn't wait to see what he would do next. With every ounce of strength I had, I pulled myself through the opening and ran for the trees at the edge of the field. The wind was so strong that I could barely stand, but I kept moving, knowing that staying in the open was a death sentence. I could hear the tornado ripping through the barn behind me, the sound of wood splintering and metal screeching as the building collapsed. I dove into a shallow ditch, covering my head as the wind roared over me, feeling the ground shake beneath me as the tornado passed. When the storm finally moved on, I was left lying in the muddy ditch, my ears ringing and my body trembling. I didn't know how long I had been there, but when I finally managed to get up, the barn was gone, completely leveled. There was no sign of the man or his rifle. The tornado had taken everything in its path, leaving nothing but wreckage in its wake. I stumbled back to the highway, my mind racing. I didn't know who the man had been or why he had reacted the way he did. All I knew was that I had narrowly escaped with my life, both from the storm and from him. Even now, the memory of that day haunts me, trapped between the fury of nature and the madness of a stranger in the path of destruction. It was a quiet afternoon when I decided to take the scenic route home through the back roads of the countryside. The long stretches of empty road felt peaceful, a welcome break from the hustle of the city. I was halfway through my drive when I spotted him. A man standing on the side of the road, his thumb out in the classic hitchhiker pose. He looked harmless enough, with a backpack slung over his shoulder and a tired expression on his face. Against my better judgment, I slowed down and pulled over. As he approached the car, I rolled down the window just a crack. "Need a lift?" I asked, trying to keep my voice casual. He nodded eagerly, thanking me as he climbed into the passenger seat. He introduced himself as Chris, said he'd been stranded after his car broke down a few miles back. I didn't think much of it. Things like that happened all the time on these remote roads. We made small talk at first, just casual conversation about the weather and where he was headed. But something about him made me uneasy. After a few minutes, I noticed him fidgeting with his backpack, glancing at me out of the corner of his eye. My instincts told me something wasn't right. The conversation had become stilted, and there was a strange tension hanging in the air. I kept my eyes on the road, but my mind was racing. Why did he seem so nervous? My pulse quickened as I began to think that maybe picking him up had been a mistake. Then he said something that made my heart skip a beat. "You know, I've been following your social media for a while now," he said, his voice low and unsettling. "It's funny meeting you like this." I felt a chill run down my spine. How could he know about me? I hadn't mentioned anything personal, hadn't given him my name. Yet somehow this stranger knew more about me than I was comfortable with. I gripped the steering wheel tighter, trying to remain calm. "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice trembling slightly. He smiled, a cold, eerie smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Oh, I know a lot about you. I've been watching you online for months. Your posts, your habits, where you like to go. It's like I already know you." His words sent a wave of panic through me. My mind raced as I realized that this was no random encounter. He hadn't just been stranded. He had planned this. I glanced at him out of the corner of my eye, noticing the way his hand was inching toward his backpack. My heart pounded in my chest, adrenaline surging as I tried to figure out what to do. I needed to get out of this situation, and fast. "I think I'm going to have to let you out here," I said, trying to keep my voice steady as I slowed the car down. But he didn't budge. Before I could react, he reached into his backpack and pulled out a knife, holding it just out of sight. "You're not going anywhere," he said quietly, his voice cold and calm. My stomach dropped and fear gripped me. My mind raced through my options, but the road was deserted. There was no one around to help, no way to call for help. I had to stay calm, had to think clearly. "Just drive," he ordered, the knife glinting in the corner of my eye. I could feel my hands shaking as I pressed down on the gas, my thoughts spinning in 100 different directions. He was controlling the situation now, and I knew I had to find a way out before things took a darker turn. My only hope was to keep him talking, to buy time until I could figure out what to do. As I drove, I tried to keep the conversation going, asking him questions in a desperate attempt to distract him. He rambled on about how he had been following me for months, how he knew everything about my life, and how he had planned this moment. My skin crawled with fear, but I kept my voice steady, pretending to stay calm. Every second felt like an eternity. Then, I saw it. A turnoff leading to an old farm road just ahead. It was narrow, overgrown, but I remembered passing it earlier and seeing a sign for a town not too far off. Without warning, I jerked the steering wheel, swerving onto the dirt road. The sudden move caught him off guard, and the car lurched as it hit the uneven terrain. He cursed, trying to steady himself, and in that moment of distraction I saw my chance. I slammed on the brakes, throwing the car into park before he could react. I ripped open my door and bolted out of the car, running as fast as I could down the road. Behind me, I heard him shout, the sound of his door opening, but I didn't stop. My heart pounded in my ears as I sprinted toward the trees at the edge of the road, knowing that if I could get far enough away, I might have a chance. I heard footsteps behind me, but I didn't dare look back. I darted into the woods, weaving between the trees, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The fear was overwhelming, but adrenaline kept me moving. After what felt like forever, I stopped, crouching behind a large tree, trying to catch my breath. The forest was silent except for the sound of the wind through the leaves. I waited there, barely breathing, listening for any sign of him. Minutes passed, and there was nothing. No footsteps, no shouting. Finally, I crept back toward the road, my legs shaking with exhaustion and fear. My car was still there, empty. I couldn't see him anywhere. I jumped back into the driver's seat, my hands trembling as I started the engine and sped away, not stopping until I reached the nearest town. When I finally told the police what had happened, they searched the area but found no trace of him. Whoever he was, he had vanished into the woods, leaving nothing behind but the memory of that terrifying ride. Even now, the thought of it chills me to the bone. I haven't picked up a hitchhiker since, and I never will again. It was supposed to be a peaceful getaway. My partner and I had rented a remote vacation home, far from the noise of the city, surrounded only by trees and rolling hills. The house itself was charming, an old farmhouse restored with modern amenities, but still holding on to its rustic charm. The isolation felt like a blessing at first. No neighbors for miles, just us and the wide open space. We spent the first few days hiking, cooking, and relaxing by the fire. But soon, things started to go wrong. The first odd thing we noticed was small, almost insignificant. An apple missing from the bowl in the kitchen. At the time, we brushed it off, thinking maybe one of us had eaten it and forgotten. But over the next few days, more items began to disappear. A pair of socks, my partner's favorite coffee mug, even some of our clothes went missing. Each time, we thought we were just being forgetful, misplacing things in the unfamiliar house. But as the days passed, the unease began to grow. One night, we woke up to a loud noise, something crashing downstairs. My partner grabbed a flashlight, and we both crept out of bed, our hearts racing. As we made our way down the stairs, the air felt thick with tension. The living room was in disarray, books scattered, furniture moved, like someone had been rummaging through our things. But the door was locked, and the windows were still closed. There was no sign of forced entry, but the evidence was clear. Someone had been inside the house. We called the local police, but they weren't much help. The officer who showed up simply shrugged and told us it was probably an animal that had gotten in through a loose board or an open window. It didn't sit right with me, but there wasn't much we could do. We double-checked the locks and tried to convince ourselves that it was just a one-time thing. But that night, something felt different. I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. The next evening, as we were settling in for dinner, the power suddenly went out. The house was plunged into darkness, and the silence that followed was deafening. We scrambled for flashlights, but the anxiety gnawed at us. Then we noticed something that made my blood run cold. Our phones were gone. They had been sitting on the kitchen counter charging, but now they were nowhere to be found. My partner and I exchanged a panicked glance. We were trapped. Just as we were processing the disappearance of our phones, we heard a noise outside, soft footsteps on the gravel driveway. I moved to the window, careful not to be seen, and peered out into the dark. A figure stood just beyond the porch, barely visible in the dim light from the moon. They were motionless, watching the house. I pulled away from the window, my heart pounding. "Someone's out there," I whispered, my voice shaking. We bolted upstairs, barricading ourselves in the bedroom, trying to stay as quiet as possible. The footsteps moved closer, circling the house. I could hear the faint creak of the porch steps, and then a soft knock at the door. My stomach twisted with fear. Whoever was outside wasn't trying to break in. They were toying with us, enjoying the fear they were causing. The knock came again, louder this time, followed by the sound of the door handle rattling. We huddled in the dark, listening as the person outside tried each door and window, one by one, looking for a way in. My partner grabbed a fireplace poker, but it felt like a flimsy defense against whatever was happening. The minutes stretched on, the sound of the intruder's footsteps moving around the house like a predator stalking its prey. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the noise stopped. The footsteps faded into the night, leaving us in terrified silence. We didn't sleep that night. The fear was suffocating, and every creak of the house sent our nerves on edge. When morning finally came, we ventured outside, hoping to find some sign of what had happened. That's when we noticed it. Footprints, leading from the back of the house to a small door we hadn't paid much attention to. The crawl space. My partner opened the door, flashlight in hand, and crawled inside. What we found made my skin crawl. There, hidden in the crawl space, were our missing belongings, clothes, mugs, even some of the food that had disappeared. And worse, there were signs that someone had been living there. A makeshift bed made of blankets, empty food wrappers, and even a small flashlight tucked in the corner. The realization hit us like a punch to the gut. Whoever had been in our house wasn't just passing through, they had been living there, watching us the entire time. We packed up and left that day, too shaken to stay another night. The police were called again, but they seemed skeptical, treating us like we were overreacting. Still, we knew the truth. Someone had been inside that house with us, moving through the rooms while we slept, taking our things and watching us from the shadows. The thought of it still haunts me. Even now, back in the safety of the city, I can't shake the feeling of being watched. Every little sound in the night makes me jump, and I've become obsessive about checking the locks. That vacation was supposed to be a retreat, a break from the stress of life. Instead, it turned into a nightmare I'll never forget. One that left me with a chilling reminder that sometimes the real danger is much closer than we think. Renovating an old house was supposed to be the start of a new adventure for me. The house had been in my family for years, sitting abandoned after my grandparents passed away. It was a beautiful place, though it had fallen into disrepair. Creaky floors, peeling wallpaper, and dust covering every surface. I planned to restore it, bringing it back to life, but from the moment I stepped inside, I could feel something was off. The first few days went smoothly enough, cleaning, stripping old wallpaper, fixing the leaky pipes. But as I got deeper into the house, strange things started happening. At night, I would hear noises coming from the attic, soft creaks and thuds that I initially dismissed as the house settling. It was an old place after all, and old houses made noise. Still, the sounds made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up, and I started locking my bedroom door at night, just in case. One afternoon, while clearing out the attic, I discovered a small hidden door in the far corner. It was barely noticeable, blending into the old wooden walls. Curiosity got the better of me, and I pried it open, revealing a narrow, musty room filled with old furniture, dusty toys, and what looked like personal belongings. It was as if someone had been living there, though it was clear the room hadn't been touched in years. That night, the noises from the attic grew louder. I woke up to the distinct sound of footsteps overhead, slow and deliberate, as if someone was pacing back and forth. My heart raced as I lay there, straining to listen. The footsteps stopped for a moment, and then the sound of something dragging across the floor echoed through the house. I couldn't ignore it anymore. There was something, or someone, in the attic. I grabbed a flashlight and cautiously made my way up the stairs. Each step creaked under my weight, and my pulse pounded in my ears. When I reached the attic, the air was cold, much colder than the rest of the house, and the smell of mildew was overwhelming. I shined the flashlight around, the beam cutting through the dust and darkness. At first, everything seemed normal, just boxes and old furniture. But then I saw it. The door to the hidden room was slightly open. My hands trembled as I approached the door. I nudged it open with the flashlight, and my stomach dropped. The room was no longer undisturbed. The furniture had been moved, and there were fresh footprints in the dust. Someone had been here. My mind raced with possibilities. Had it been a homeless person, sneaking in at night? Or something worse? My breath caught as I heard a creak behind me. I spun around, the flashlight's beam landing on the far corner of the attic. Standing there, just beyond the reach of the light, was a figure. Tall, gaunt, and covered in grime. My heart nearly stopped as the figure took a step toward me, and I caught a glimpse of his face, wild eyes, gaunt cheeks, and a malicious grin. I stumbled back, my body frozen in terror. This wasn't just some random intruder. The man lunged at me, and I barely managed to dodge out of the way, crashing into a pile of boxes. He moved with an unsettling calmness, as if he had all the time in the world, and I realized with horror that I had no idea who he was, or how long he had been living in the attic. My only thought was to escape. I scrambled to my feet and ran down the stairs, the sound of his footsteps thundering behind me. I slammed the attic door shut, bolting it as quickly as I could, but I knew it wouldn't hold for long. My mind raced as I tried to figure out what to do. My phone was downstairs, but going back for it meant risking another encounter. Just as I was about to make a run for it, I heard him on the other side of the door, his voice low and menacing. "You should have left it alone," he whispered, his breath audible through the door. My heart pounded in my chest as I ran downstairs, every instinct screaming at me to get out of the house. I grabbed my phone and frantically dialed the police. As I waited for them to arrive, I barricaded myself in the living room, my eyes glued to the staircase, listening for any sound. I could hear him moving upstairs, pacing back and forth like a predator waiting to strike. When the police finally arrived, I felt a wave of relief. But the nightmare wasn't over. They found the man hiding in the attic, surrounded by the remnants of his makeshift living space. As they dragged him out, I overheard one of the officers mention that he was an escaped convict who had been on the run for weeks. He had been using abandoned houses like mine to hide from the authorities, living in secret while unsuspecting owners went about their lives. Even after the man was taken away, I couldn't shake the feeling of dread that clung to me. The house, once a place of nostalgia and comfort, now felt tainted, haunted by the memory of what had happened. I left the renovations unfinished, unable to stay in the house another night. It wasn't just the man that haunted me. It was the knowledge that he had been there all along, watching, waiting for the moment I would discover him. I haven't been back to the house since. It sits empty now, abandoned once again, but the fear still lingers. Every time I hear a creak in the night or the sound of footsteps overhead, I'm reminded of that attic and the man who had hidden there, unseen for so long. It started as a routine drive through the mountains, a simple route I had taken many times before. The road wound through steep cliffs and dense forests, with breathtaking views that stretched for miles. But that day, the weather changed faster than I could have anticipated. One moment the skies were clear, and the next dark clouds had gathered, and the wind began to howl through the trees. I could feel the tension in the air, the unmistakable pressure drop that signaled a storm was coming. The rain came in a torrential downpour, hammering against the windshield, making it nearly impossible to see the road ahead. I slowed down, gripping the wheel tightly as the car's tires struggled to maintain traction on the slick mountain road. My headlights barely cut through the darkness, and the narrow road seemed even more treacherous with every turn. The storm raged on, and soon I realized I hadn't seen another car for miles. I was completely alone. Then, something strange happened. The road behind me, where I had just come from, began to disappear. It wasn't just obscured by rain or fog, it was gone, swallowed up by the earth itself. In the rear-view mirror, I could see the edge of the road crumbling, a landslide sweeping it away into the abyss below. My stomach twisted in fear. I couldn't turn back. I had to keep moving forward. As the rain pounded harder, the road ahead seemed to stretch endlessly into the storm. I was in the middle of nowhere, with no signs, no mile markers, and no indication of where I was. My GPS had lost signal hours ago, and there was no phone service this high up in the mountains. I pressed on, hoping to find some sign of civilization, a gas station, a rest stop, anything. That's when I noticed something moving in the storm. At first, I thought it was just the wind whipping through the trees, but as I squinted through the rain-splattered windshield, I realized it was a figure. A person, walking along the side of the road, barely visible through the sheets of rain. I slowed down, unsure of what to do. No one should have been out here, not in this weather. The figure was hunched over, wearing what looked like an old coat, the hood pulled low over their face. I rolled down the window just enough to call out, but the wind drowned out my voice. The figure didn't respond, didn't even turn toward the car. Instead, they continued walking, their pace slow and deliberate. A chill ran down my spine. Something about the way they moved felt wrong, unnatural. My instincts screamed at me to drive away, but my curiosity got the better of me. I rolled the window down a little further and shouted again, but they still didn't acknowledge me. Suddenly, the car's engine sputtered, and the lights flickered. Panic surged through me as the engine stalled, leaving me stranded in the middle of the storm. I frantically tried to restart the car, my heart racing, but the engine wouldn't turn over. I was stuck. I glanced out the window again, and that's when I saw the figure, now standing directly in front of the car, illuminated by the flickering headlights. They were watching me. My breath caught in my throat. The figure's face was obscured by the rain and darkness, but I could feel their gaze piercing through the storm, locking onto me. Every instinct told me to get out of the car and run, but where would I go? The road behind me had disappeared, and the only way forward was blocked by this mysterious figure. Without warning, the figure stepped closer, slowly walking toward the driver's side door. I fumbled for the door lock. My hands were shaking too much to press the button. The figure's hand reached out, brushing against the window, leaving a smear of dirt and rainwater. My heart pounded in my chest as I realized they weren't just watching. They were trying to get inside. Desperation took over. I slammed my hand on the horn, hoping the sound would scare them off, but it did nothing. The figure stood there, unfazed, their hand now resting on the door handle. Just as I thought they were going to pull it open, the lights of the car flickered back to life, and the engine roared to life again. I didn't think. I slammed my foot on the gas, the tires screeching as the car lurched forward. The figure stepped aside at the last moment, disappearing into the rain. My heart raced as I sped down the road, not daring to look back. But even as I drove, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was still being watched. The storm seemed to follow me, relentless and unforgiving. The road ahead twisted and turned through the mountains, but no matter how far I drove, I couldn't find my way out. Every bend in the road looked the same, every mile blending into the next. It was as if the road itself had trapped me, looping endlessly through the storm. I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the figure again, but there was nothing, just the darkness and the rain. Hours passed, or maybe minutes, it was impossible to tell. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what had happened. The storm was showing no signs of letting up, and the road ahead remained a shadowy, twisted path. Just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, I saw it, a gas station up ahead, its flickering neon sign barely visible through the storm. Relief washed over me as I pulled into the station, my hands still trembling. The storm raged on, but at least I was off the road. I parked the car and stepped out, the wind nearly knocking me over as I made my way to the gas station's door. But when I reached the entrance, my stomach dropped. The door was locked and the station was dark inside. Abandoned. I turned back toward the road, and that's when I saw it. The The figure was standing at the edge of the gas station's lot, watching me from the rain-soaked shadows. My blood ran cold. I wasn't alone, and I hadn't escaped. It was supposed to be a relaxing family getaway, a summer retreat in a secluded cabin nestled deep in the woods. We had rented the cabin for a week, hoping to escape the noise of the city and spend some quality time together. The first few days were peaceful. The kids played by the lake. We had long hikes through the forest, and the nights were filled with the comforting sounds of nature. The isolation felt perfect, a true escape. But by the fourth night, things started to take a chilling turn. It began with small noises. At first, it was just the sound of twigs snapping in the distance, the kind of noise you might expect from an animal wandering through the woods. But the sound seemed to get closer, like someone or something was moving toward the cabin. We tried to ignore it, dismissing it as wildlife, but the tension in the air made it hard to relax. The forest, which had once felt serene, now felt suffocating. Late one night, we heard footsteps outside. Slow, deliberate footsteps crunching through the gravel just beyond the front porch. I looked at my partner, my heart racing. We hadn't seen another person for miles since we arrived, and the idea that someone might be out there in the darkness, watching us, sent a shiver down my spine. We turned off the lights, creeping to the window to peek outside. There was no one there, just the empty porch illuminated by the dim glow of the moon. But we knew we hadn't imagined it. The footsteps had been real. We double-checked the locks and tried to shake off the feeling of unease, but sleep didn't come easily that night. Every creak of the cabin made my heart race, and every gust of wind outside sounded like someone creeping closer. The next morning, we woke up to find strange things missing from the cabin. Small items, like a flashlight, some food from the kitchen, and even one of the kids' toys. At first, we thought maybe we had misplaced them, but the more we searched, the more we realized they were gone. My partner and I exchanged uneasy glances. Someone had been inside the cabin while we slept. Determined not to scare the kids, we tried to keep calm and rationalize the situation. Maybe it had been an animal, or perhaps we had left the back door unlocked by accident. But deep down, we both knew the truth. Someone had been watching us, and they had taken the opportunity to slip inside. The thought made my skin crawl. That night, the tension escalated. As we sat around the fire, the same slow, deliberate footsteps returned. This time they were closer, circling the cabin. The sound of gravel underfoot sent a wave of dread through me. We called out, thinking it might scare whoever or whatever, but there was no response. The footsteps stopped for a moment, and then we heard a soft knock on the door. My partner grabbed the fireplace poker, motioning for me to take the kids upstairs. My heart pounded as I herded them into the bedroom, locking the door behind us. I pressed my ear against the door, listening intently as the soft knock came again. It wasn't forceful, just insistent, like whoever was outside knew we were terrified and was enjoying it. Downstairs, my partner called out again, but the only response was the sound of something scraping against the side of the cabin. The scratching noise sent a chill down my spine, and I held the kids close, whispering reassurances I didn't believe. We waited in tense silence, the air thick with fear. Outside, the footsteps moved toward the back of the house, and then we heard the back door creak open. The next few moments felt like a blur of panic. My partner rushed upstairs, and we barricaded ourselves in the bedroom. The footsteps inside the cabin were unmistakable now. Someone was moving through the house, slow and steady, as if they had all the time in the world. My partner held the fireplace poker tightly, and I grabbed the nearest thing I could find, a heavy lamp. Minutes felt like hours as we waited in the dark, every sound amplified by the silence of the woods outside. Then, just as suddenly as they had started, the footsteps stopped. We held our breath, listening for any sign of movement, but the cabin was eerily quiet. My partner carefully unlocked the door and stepped out into the hallway, flashlight in hand. The cabin was empty. Whoever had been inside was gone, leaving no trace behind. But as we checked the house, we noticed something else. More items were missing, this time including some of our clothes and my partner's shoes. It was clear now. Whoever had been watching us was more than just a curious trespasser. They had been inside, watching us sleep, and taking what they wanted. The police arrived hours later, but by then, the intruder was long gone. They found no footprints, no evidence of forced entry, nothing that could explain how someone had managed to get in and out so easily. The only thing they found was a small, crudely carved symbol etched into the back door, a circle with an X through it. The sight of it sent a fresh wave of dread through me. We left the cabin that morning, cutting our vacation short. But even as we drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The forest felt alive, as if it had eyes hidden in the shadows, tracking our every move. And that symbol? It still haunts me, a reminder that we weren't just trespassed upon, we were hunted. The long, empty desert highway stretched out endlessly before us, nothing but sand and scrub brush as far as the eye could see. My partner and I were in the middle of a road trip, driving through one of the most desolate stretches of land we'd ever seen. There were no cars, no towns, no signs of life for hours. The isolation was unsettling, but we were both tired and looking forward to finding somewhere to stop for the night. That's when we spotted it. A gas station in the distance, its neon sign flickering in the evening light. We pulled in, relieved to see signs of civilization, though the place seemed abandoned. The building was small and run down, the windows covered in dust, and there was only one pump. Still, we figured it was better than nothing. I stepped out of the car, the dry heat hitting me like a wall, and made my way to the station's door. It was locked, but a small sign in the window read, "Back in 10 minutes." We decided to wait, hoping the attendant would return soon. The sun was setting, and the desert sky turned from orange to deep purple, casting eerie shadows across the sand. My partner went to check the pump, only to discover it was out of order. As we stood there debating whether to wait or move on, I felt a strange unease creeping over me. The place felt wrong, too quiet, too empty, as if it had been abandoned for a long time. Suddenly, the wind picked up, blowing dust across the lot. That's when we realized something even more unsettling. The car wouldn't start. My partner tried the ignition again and again, but the engine just sputtered and died. Panic flickered in their eyes as we both realized we were stranded, alone, in the middle of the desert with night quickly approaching. I glanced back at the gas station, its neon sign flickering weakly, casting a sickly glow over the empty lot. We decided to wait inside the car, hoping the attendant would return and help us out. Minutes passed, then hours, and the desert night grew colder. Still, there was no sign of anyone. The station remained dark and lifeless, as if it hadn't been used in years. I pulled out my phone to check for signal, but there was none. Not surprising out here, but still, it added to the growing sense of dread. As we sat in the car, the darkness pressing in around us, we heard something. A faint tapping, coming from the far side of the station. My partner and I exchanged uneasy glances. The tapping grew louder, more insistent, and we realized it wasn't the wind. Someone or something was out there, just beyond the glow of the neon sign, making its way toward us. We locked the car doors, our hearts pounding in our chests. The tapping turned into a slow, rhythmic scrape, like metal dragging against concrete. It was close now, right outside the car, and I could feel the tension building inside me. I dared to glance out the window, but saw nothing in the darkness beyond. The scraping continued, circling the car, methodical and unnerving. Suddenly, something thumped against the back of the car, hard enough to make it rock. My breath caught in my throat as I turned to look, but the rear window was completely fogged up. The tapping resumed, this time coming from directly behind us. My partner whispered, "We need to get out of here." But we were trapped. The car wouldn't start, and the nearest town was miles away. Desperation surged through me. I fumbled with my phone again, hoping for a miracle, but there was still no signal. The tapping grew louder, more frantic, as if whatever was out there was losing patience. My partner grabbed a flashlight from the glove compartment, shining it through the back window. For a split second, the beam caught something. A figure, hunched over, its face hidden in shadow. I gasped, and my partner quickly killed the light, both of us sitting in stunned silence. The figure had been real, not some trick of the mind. We had to move, but where could we go? Just as I was about to suggest making a run for it, the car's lights flickered and the engine roared to life on its own. Without thinking, my partner slammed the car into gear, and we peeled out of the lot, the tires kicking up dust as we sped away from the station. The neon sign flickered in the rearview mirror as we drove, but the unease didn't leave us. Something had been out there, something that had been watching us, waiting for the moment to strike. We didn't stop driving until we reached the next town, hours later, exhausted and shaken. When we finally found a motel, the attendant looked surprised to see us. "Where'd you come from?" he asked. "Not much out there except that old gas station, but it's been abandoned for years." The blood drained from my face as his words sank in. I stammered, explaining how we had been there, how the sign had been lit, and how we'd heard someone, or something, outside. The attendant shook his head, looking confused. "Must have been a mistake," he said. "That place hasn't had power in years. Ain't nobody been working there for a long time." We didn't ask any more questions. Even now, I can't explain what happened that night at the gas station, but I know one thing for sure. I'll never drive that road again. Whatever was out there, whatever had been lurking in the shadows, it wasn't human. And it was waiting for us. When we moved into the quiet, suburban neighborhood, everything seemed perfect. The house was charming, with a white picket fence, a spacious yard, and a neighborhood that felt like something out of a movie. We were excited to start fresh, away from the chaos of the city. The neighbors welcomed us with smiles and warm greetings, and for the first few weeks, it felt like we had found our dream home. But then, the notes started appearing. It was subtle at first. One morning, I stepped outside to grab the newspaper and found a small slip of paper folded neatly on the doorstep. It was a simple message, scrawled in shaky handwriting. "You should know about the house." At first, I thought it was some kind of prank, a weird welcome from a nosy neighbor. But as the days passed, more notes began to appear. Some were tucked under the doormat, others slipped into the mailbox. Each one was more cryptic than the last. "The house has secrets," one read. Another simply said, "It's not safe." I didn't know what to make of them. My partner and I laughed it off at first, assuming it was just someone playing a prank. We told ourselves it was nothing serious, but deep down, a nagging feeling of unease started to settle in. Then, the noises began. Late at night, after the house had fallen silent, we'd hear faint creaking from the attic. The sound wasn't consistent, but it was enough to make me pause, straining my ears in the dark to figure out what it was. One night, the sound was louder, distinct footsteps echoing above our heads. My heart raced as I nudged my partner awake. We both sat in the dark, listening to the unmistakable sound of someone walking in the attic. But when we checked, flashlight in hand, there was no one there. The attic was empty, just a few old boxes and some dust-covered furniture. But the feeling of being watched lingered, chilling and unsettling. As the weeks went on, the sense of dread grew. The notes continued, each one more disturbing than the last. "They never left," read one of the most recent messages. We tried asking the neighbors about the previous owners, but they seemed hesitant to talk. One neighbor, an elderly woman who had lived in the neighborhood for decades, finally broke her silence. She told us that something terrible had happened in the house years ago, but the details were murky. A family had lived there before us, but they had disappeared without a trace. "People don't stay in that house long," she warned. "It has a way of getting under your skin." The more I thought about it, the more the house seemed to close in on us. The noises from the attic became more frequent, louder, as if whoever or whatever was up there was getting bolder. We started finding things out of place. Doors that had been locked were suddenly open. Lights we were sure we'd turned off would flicker back on. The house itself seemed to pulse with a strange energy, and I began to wonder if we had made a terrible mistake by moving in. One night, I woke to a loud crash coming from downstairs. My heart pounded in my chest as I grabbed my phone and crept down the stairs. The living room was in disarray. Books knocked off shelves, the coffee table overturned as if someone had ransacked the place. But again, no one was there. As I stood frozen in the middle of the room, I heard it, the soft, unmistakable sound of a door creaking open behind me. I spun around, my breath catching in my throat. The basement door, which we always kept locked, was now wide open. My partner rushed down, flashlight in hand, and together we stood at the top of the stairs, staring into the dark abyss of the basement. We had never gone down there before. There was something about it that felt wrong, as if the house itself was warning us to stay away. But now, we had no choice. We had to see what was down there. The basement was cold, the air thick with dust and mildew. The smell was overpowering, and as we descended the stairs, I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. The flashlight beam swept across the room, illuminating old furniture and stacks of boxes. But then, in the far corner, we saw it, a door. It was small, almost hidden behind a pile of old crates, and it looked like it hadn't been opened in years. My partner hesitated, but I couldn't resist. I had to know. I reached out and turned the rusted knob, pushing the door open with a creak. What we found inside sent a chill down my spine. The room was small and bare, except for one thing, a large blackened stain on the floor. The walls were covered in crude, childlike drawings scratched into the plaster. But it was the smell that got to me, an overwhelming stench of decay and rot, like something had died and been left to fester. We called the police, and what they discovered was far worse than we could have imagined. Years ago, the family who had lived here had vanished. But the truth was even darker. The stain on the floor? Blood. The drawings on the wall? Left behind by a child who had witnessed something unspeakable. And the basement? It had been sealed off after the investigation, but no one had ever been able to explain what had really happened. We moved out the next day, unable to stay in the house any longer. The feeling of being watched, the sense of dread that hung in the air, it was too much. Even now, thinking back on it sends a shiver down my spine. The house still stands, waiting for its next occupants, but I'll never forget what happened there. Some houses have dark pasts, and some secrets are better left buried. I had been driving down that lonely stretch of road for what felt like hours. It was the kind of road that seemed to stretch endlessly into the night, with nothing but the occasional flicker of distant headlights or the soft hum of my car engine to keep me company. The darkness was thick, with only my headlights cutting through the dense night air. I was on my way back from visiting a friend in a rural town, and I couldn't shake the feeling of isolation that hung over the highway. That's when I saw him. A hitchhiker standing by the side of the road, his figure illuminated by the beam of my headlights. He was holding out his thumb, a bag slung over his shoulder, looking tired but otherwise harmless. Against my better judgment, I slowed down. Something about the way he stood there, alone in the middle of nowhere, tugged at my sense of compassion. I pulled over, the car coming to a stop just a few feet away from him. He walked up to the passenger window, his face shadowed by the darkness, but I could make out a soft smile. "Thank you," he said quietly as he opened the door and slid into the seat beside me. He looked like he'd been on the road for a while. His clothes were worn, and there was a tiredness in his eyes that seemed to go beyond physical exhaustion. I asked where he was headed, and he mentioned a town a few miles up the road. As we drove, we made small talk. He told me his name was Ben, and that his car had broken down earlier that day. He'd been walking for hours, hoping someone would eventually come along. There was something about his voice that put me at ease, and for a moment, I forgot how strange it was to pick up a hitchhiker so late at night. The conversation flowed easily, but there was a strange undercurrent to it, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. As we approached the town, the road seemed to get narrower, the trees on either side growing thicker, their branches reaching out like skeletal arms. The atmosphere in the car shifted, growing heavier, more oppressive. I glanced over at Ben, who was staring straight ahead, his face expressionless now, the warmth from earlier gone. A chill crept up my spine, and I gripped the steering wheel a little tighter. When we reached the town, it was quiet, eerily quiet. There were no lights in the windows, no signs of life. It felt like we had driven into a ghost town. "This is it," Ben said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. I slowed down, glancing around at the empty streets. "Are you sure?" I asked, feeling uneasy. He nodded, but didn't look at me. I pulled over by the curb, and Ben reached for the door handle. Before he got out, he turned to me, his eyes locking onto mine. "Thank you for the ride," he said, his voice now strangely hollow. "Not many people stop." I nodded, feeling a strange sense of dread creeping over me. He opened the door, stepped out into the night, and disappeared into the shadows of the town without another word. As soon as the door closed, I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. The feeling of unease lingered as I sat there for a moment, staring at the spot where Ben had vanished. Something didn't feel right. I pulled away from the curb, eager to leave the strange, silent town behind. But as I drove, the sense of dread only grew stronger. A few minutes down the road, I glanced at the passenger seat, and my blood ran cold. The seat was completely dry. Ben had been soaked from the rain when he got into the car, but there wasn't a single drop of water where he had been sitting. My heart raced as I replayed the conversation in my head. Who was Ben, and why had he seemed so strange? I couldn't shake the feeling that I had just experienced something far more unsettling than a simple ride. Determined to find answers, I turned the car around and headed back to the town. When I arrived, it looked even more desolate than before, the streets empty and lifeless. I drove around for a while, searching for any sign of Ben, but there was nothing. No movement, no lights, just silence. I stopped the car and got out, walking the streets, calling his name. But the town was like a ghost, frozen in time, untouched by the living. That's when I saw it, a small plaque on the side of an old building. It was weathered and worn, but I could still make out the name on it. Ben Jacobs, 1982-2002. My heart sank. It couldn't be. I stared at the plaque, my mind racing, trying to piece together what was happening. I had just given a ride to a man named Ben, but if this plaque was right, he had died over 20 years ago. I raced back to the car, my pulse pounding in my ears. As I drove away from the town, the truth settled in, chilling me to the bone. Ben had been a ghost, a spirit lingering on that lonely stretch of road, waiting for someone to pick him up, reliving the same moment over and over. The ride had felt real, but the truth was far more haunting than I could have ever imagined. Even now, as I tell the story, I can't explain what happened that night. All I know is that when I look back, there's a part of me that still wonders if I really saw him, or if I had just become another driver haunted by the memory of a hitchhiker who never left. It was late, later than I should have been out driving, but I'd had no choice. I was on a long, forested highway that cut through miles of dark, dense woods. The road twisted and turned, each corner more isolated than the last. My headlights were the only thing lighting the way, and the road ahead seemed to stretch on forever into the night. I was exhausted, but I just needed to make it through the next hour and I'd reach home. Or so I thought. At first, I didn't notice the car behind me. It was just a pair of headlights in the distance, steadily growing closer. No big deal, but after a few minutes, those headlights were right on my bumper. I glanced in the rearview mirror, trying to make out the driver, but the glare from their high beams blinded me. The car was tailgating me aggressively, too close for comfort. My heart rate spiked. I tapped the brakes lightly to signal for them to back off, but they didn't. Instead, they flashed their high beams again, over and over, making it clear they wanted me to pull over. I was caught between fear and confusion. What did they want? There was no reason for anyone to be out here this late, especially not driving like a maniac. I eased up on the gas, hoping they'd pass me, but they stayed right behind me, the high beams lighting up the inside of my car. Nervous now, I picked up speed, hoping to outrun them, but the car matched my every move, staying right on my tail. My pulse quickened as I gripped the steering wheel tighter, my mind racing. What was going on? Were they just messing with me? Or was there something more sinister at play? The isolated stretch of road offered no help. No other cars, no exits, just miles of trees on either side. That's when I realized the road was narrowing, forcing me to slow down. The car behind me honked aggressively, as if demanding that I pull over. Panic surged through me, and I weighed my options. Should I pull over and confront them, or try to find a way out of this? Before I could make a decision, the car sped up even more, now dangerously close. I could practically feel their bumper nudging mine. I spotted a small dirt road branching off the highway up ahead. Without thinking, I swerved onto it, kicking up dust as I tried to shake the car behind me. For a brief moment, I thought I'd lost them, the sound of their engine fading as I sped down the narrow path. But then, there it was again. The headlights, bouncing over the uneven ground, closing in fast. I pressed the gas pedal harder, my heart pounding in my chest. The road twisted and turned, the trees becoming a blur as I raced deeper into the forest. The car was still behind me, relentless, their high beams cutting through the darkness like knives. I had no idea where this road led, but I didn't care. I just needed to get away. The road became rougher, rocks and potholes jolting the car as I tried to maintain control. The car behind me stayed steady, never faltering, as if the driver knew this road all too well. I glanced in the rearview mirror again, hoping to catch a glimpse of who was behind the wheel, but all I could see was the blinding glare of their lights. It was like a nightmare, one where no matter how fast I ran, the danger was always right behind me. Suddenly, the dirt road split in two, and I made a split-second decision to take the left path, hoping it would lead me back to the main highway. The car behind me hesitated for a moment, but then followed, the chase continuing. My hands were shaking, and I could feel the sweat on my palms as I clutched the steering wheel. I couldn't keep this up much longer. I needed a way out. Then, out of nowhere, my car hit something, a large rock or maybe a tree root, and skidded to a stop. My heart leapt into my throat as I realized I was stuck. The engine sputtered and died, and I was left in the dead of night, surrounded by trees, with the other car closing in. I fumbled for my phone, but of course there was no signal out here. The headlights of the other car grew brighter as it approached. I considered making a run for it, but where would I go? The woods were thick, and I'd be easily caught. The car came to a slow stop just a few feet behind mine, its high beams flooding the area with harsh light. I couldn't see the driver, but I could feel their eyes on me, watching. For a moment, everything was still. The car idled behind me, the engine rumbling softly in the night. Then, the driver's door creaked open. My heart pounded in my chest as I watched the shadowy figure step out, moving slowly toward my car. My mind raced, trying to figure out what to do. Run? Hide? Fight? None of those options seemed good. But just as the figure reached my car, a miracle happened. The faint sound of another engine in the distance, a truck coming down the main road. The figure froze, and I saw them glance toward the sound. The truck's headlights cut through the trees, illuminating the dirt road like a beacon. Without a word, the figure turned, got back into their car, and sped off into the woods, disappearing into the night. I sat there, trembling, as the truck pulled up beside me. The driver, an older man with a concerned look, leaned out the window. "You all right?" he asked, his voice gruff but kind. I nodded, still too shaken to speak, as relief flooded over me. He offered me a ride back to the main road, and I didn't hesitate to accept. As we drove away, I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see those headlights again. Even now, I can't shake the feeling that whoever was in that car wasn't just some reckless driver. They had been hunting me, and if that truck hadn't shown up when it did, I might not have made it out of those woods alive. I had been driving for hours, and exhaustion was creeping in. The open road had a way of draining you, and as the night stretched on, I found myself struggling to keep my eyes open. I had originally planned to make it to the next town, but it was clear I wasn't going to make it that far. That's when I saw the flickering neon sign for a motel up ahead. It was small, almost hidden among the trees that lined the highway, but it was a welcome sight. I pulled in without a second thought. The motel looked old, like it had been there for decades without a single update. The paint was peeling, the windows were dark, and the parking lot was empty, except for one car parked near the office. The neon sign buzzed faintly, casting a dim, eerie glow over the building. I hesitated for a moment, but the thought of a bed and a few hours of sleep was too tempting to pass up. I grabbed my bag and headed inside. The lobby was empty. A single bell sat on the counter, and a faded map of the area hung on the wall behind it. I rang the bell, the sound echoing through the small space. After a moment, an older man appeared from the back room. His eyes were tired, his expression distant, like he had seen one too many travelers pass through this place. "Room for the night?" he asked, his voice flat. I nodded, and after a brief exchange he handed me a key. "Room 5. "End of the row," he muttered, barely glancing at me as he disappeared back into the office. The whole interaction left me feeling uneasy, but I shrugged it off. It was late, and all I wanted was to crash for a few hours before hitting the road again. The room was exactly what you'd expect from an old roadside motel, small, outdated, and barely clean. The bed was made, though the sheets looked like they hadn't been changed in a while, and there was a musty smell that clung to the air. I tossed my bag on the chair and went to check the door, making sure the lock worked. It did, but I still felt a strange sense of vulnerability. Something about the place felt off, but I couldn't put my finger on it. I lay down on the bed, exhaustion pulling me into sleep almost immediately. But it wasn't long before something woke me, a noise from outside. I sat up, my heart racing as I listened. At first I thought it was just the wind, but then I heard it again. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps moving past my door. I held my breath, listening as the sound faded, but a few minutes later it came back, closer this time. I got out of bed and went to the window, peeking through the curtains. At first, I didn't see anything, just the dimly lit parking lot and the shadowy outline of the other motel rooms. But then I noticed a figure standing near the office, staring in my direction. My stomach dropped. The figure was barely visible in the darkness. But there was something about the way they stood, completely still, that sent a chill down my spine. I stepped back from the window, unsure of what to do. Maybe it was just another guest, I told myself. Maybe it was nothing. But the footsteps came again, this time directly outside my door. I froze, my pulse quickening as I heard the faint sound of someone tapping on the doorframe. It wasn't a knock. It was a soft, rhythmic tapping, like someone trying to get my attention without making too much noise. I moved toward the door, my hand hovering over the lock, but something stopped me, a gut feeling that told me not to open it. Instead, I backed away slowly, grabbing my phone from the nightstand. No signal. Of course. My heart pounded in my chest as I stared at the door, waiting for something, anything to happen. The tapping stopped, and for a moment, there was only silence. Then from the window, I heard a soft, scraping sound. I turned toward the window, my breath catching in my throat. The figure was standing there now, right outside, their face obscured by the darkness. They were just standing there, watching. I couldn't make out any details, but I knew they were looking directly at me. Panic surged through me as I fumbled with the curtains, pulling them closed. I backed away from the window, my heart racing, unsure of what to do. Should I confront them? Call the front desk? But something about the way they stood there, so still, so silent, told me that whatever was happening wasn't normal. I locked the bathroom door and sat in the tub, clutching my phone as if that could somehow protect me. Time passed slowly, every sound in the room amplified by my fear. Eventually, I fell into a fitful sleep, the exhaustion finally overwhelming my panic. When I woke, the room was eerily quiet. The light from the early morning sun seeped through the cracks in the curtains, and for a moment I convinced myself that it had all been a bad dream. But when I glanced at the window, my heart sank. Scratched into the glass, just faint enough to be missed if you weren't looking closely, were 3 words: I was here. I didn't stick around to check out. I grabbed my bag and bolted for the car, my hands shaking as I turned the key in the ignition. The engine roared to life, and I sped out of the parking lot, not daring to look back at the motel. As I drove away, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see that figure standing at the edge of the lot, watching me leave. Even now, I can't explain what happened that night. The scratches on the window, the figure outside my room, it all feels like a bad dream. But I know it was real, and I'll never set foot in another roadside motel again. The mountains had always been my escape, remote, quiet, and far removed from the chaos of everyday life. This time was no different. My friend Josh and I had planned this hiking trip for weeks, eager to spend a few days exploring the untouched wilderness of the remote mountain range. We packed light, prepared for anything nature could throw our way. Or so we thought. The first few days were perfect. Clear skies, cool air, and stunning views. But on the third day, we stumbled upon something that would change everything. It was an old, crumbling cabin, tucked away deep in the woods, where no one would expect to find a structure. The roof had partially caved in, and the windows were shattered, but the cabin's eerie presence in the middle of nowhere made us stop in our tracks. Curiosity got the better of us, and we decided to check it out, despite the growing sense of unease creeping up my spine. The inside was just as decayed as the outside. Dust covered every surface, and strange, ancient symbols were carved into the wooden beams and walls. It was unsettling, to say the least, but we didn't linger. Something about the cabin felt off, like we weren't supposed to be there. Josh suggested we leave immediately, and I agreed, though I couldn't shake the feeling that we had already overstayed our welcome. That night, as we set up camp a few miles away, the atmosphere felt different. The air was thick with tension, and the forest, usually full of life and sound, was unnervingly quiet. As the sun set, an unsettling chill settled over the campsite. We tried to shake it off, but it was hard to ignore the feeling that we were being watched. We didn't say much that night, both of us lost in our thoughts about the cabin and those strange symbols. Just after midnight, I woke to the sound of footsteps outside the tent. My heart skipped a beat as I listened closely, hoping it was just an animal, but the steps were slow, deliberate, too heavy for any wildlife in the area. I nudged Josh awake, whispering that someone or something was outside. He grabbed the flashlight, but when we unzipped the tent and shined the light into the trees, there was nothing. Just silence and darkness. We didn't sleep much after that. Every little sound seemed magnified in the eerie quiet of the forest. By morning, both of us were exhausted but eager to pack up and move on. As we gathered our things, we noticed something that sent a chill down my spine. Strange symbols, just like the ones in the cabin, had been carved into the trees around our campsite. It was as if someone had been there during the night, watching us, marking the area with those same unsettling shapes. We hiked all day, putting as much distance between us and the cabin as possible. But as the sun began to set, the feeling of unease returned, stronger than before. The trail seemed unfamiliar, and we couldn't shake the feeling that we were going in circles, even though we had followed the map carefully. It was like the forest itself was changing, twisting around us, leading us deeper into its grasp. As darkness fell, we realized we were lost. The trail had disappeared, and the trees seemed to close in around us. Josh tried to keep calm, suggesting we set up camp and wait until morning to find our bearings. But something about the night felt wrong, like we wouldn't make it until morning if we stayed. There was a presence in the air, something unseen but unmistakable. In the dead of night, I woke up to the sound of whispering. It was faint, like voices carried on the wind, but it was unmistakable. I shook Josh awake again, and this time, we both heard it. The whispers were coming from all around us, though we couldn't make out any words. The flashlight flickered, casting eerie shadows on the trees, and that's when we saw it. A figure, barely visible in the darkness, standing at the edge of the campsite. We froze, too terrified to move, as the figure slowly stepped closer. It was tall, its face hidden in shadow, but its presence radiated menace. Josh grabbed my arm, whispering that we needed to run, but my legs felt like lead. The figure moved closer still, and that's when the whispers grew louder, more frantic, surrounding us from every direction. In a moment of sheer panic, we bolted. Running blindly through the forest, we dodged branches and stumbled over roots, desperate to escape whatever was following us. But no matter how fast we ran, we couldn't shake the feeling that something was right behind us, just out of sight. The whispers followed, growing louder with every step. At some point, we got separated. I don't know when or how, but one moment Josh was right behind me, and the next, he was gone. I called out for him, my voice shaking, but the only response was the sound of the whispers, now deafening. I ran for what felt like hours until I collapsed at the edge of a clearing, gasping for breath. The whispers had stopped, but the forest was deathly quiet. I waited there until sunrise, too scared to move, my mind racing with fear and confusion. When the first light of day broke through the trees, I retraced my steps, calling out for Josh, but he was nowhere to be found. I searched for hours, but it was like he had vanished into thin air. The forest offered no clues, no signs of where he had gone. Eventually, I made my way back to civilization, but I never saw Josh again. Search parties were sent out, but they found nothing. No tracks, no signs of struggle. It was as if he had disappeared off the face of the earth. Even now, I can't explain what happened that night. But those whispers, those symbols, they still haunt me. And I know deep down that something in those mountains had been waiting for us. I'd been warned about the highway before. Locals said there was a stretch of road that people avoided, especially at night. They told stories about strange happenings, cars breaking down for no reason, and travelers who swore they saw figures along the side of the road. But I didn't think much of it. I was running late for a delivery, and time was money. I had no choice but to take the quickest route, even if that meant driving down the so-called haunted stretch of highway. It was late, well past midnight, and the road was completely deserted. The headlights from my truck cut through the darkness, illuminating nothing but endless asphalt and the occasional tree swaying in the wind. The eerie silence of the road made me uneasy, but I chalked it up to exhaustion. I'd been driving for hours, and the thought of getting home was the only thing keeping me going. About halfway through the stretch, the truck's engine started to sputter. I cursed under my breath, glancing down at the dashboard. The fuel gauge was fine, and there were no warning lights. Yet, the engine continued to stutter as if something was wrong. I pulled over to the side of the road, hoping it was just a minor issue. The truck came to a stop, and I sat there for a moment, debating whether to get out and check under the hood. That's when I saw them. Standing by the side of the road, just ahead in the glow of my headlights, were two figures. At first, I thought they were hitchhikers, but something about the way they stood there, completely still, sent a shiver down my spine. I squinted through the windshield, trying to make out their faces, but they were too far away. A sense of dread settled over me as I realized they hadn't moved since I'd spotted them. The truck's engine suddenly died, plunging me into an uncomfortable silence. I sat there, gripping the steering wheel, unsure of what to do. The figures remained motionless, their silhouettes just barely visible in the dim light. I considered getting out, but the pit in my stomach told me that was a bad idea. Instead, I reached for my phone to call for help. No signal. Of course, out here I was completely on my own. I tried to start the truck again, but the engine refused to turn over. The headlights flickered once before going dark, leaving me in complete blackness. My heart pounded as I glanced back toward the road. The figures were gone. I blinked, my mind racing. Had they moved? Were they closer now? I couldn't see anything in the pitch-black night. Seconds felt like hours as I sat there, listening to the sound of my own breathing. Then in the distance, I heard something. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps coming from the direction of the road. I swallowed hard, gripping the steering wheel tighter. The footsteps grew louder, and I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. Someone, or something, was coming. Just as the footsteps reached the side of my truck, they stopped. My pulse was racing, my mind screaming at me to do something, but I couldn't move. The silence was suffocating, and I strained to listen for any sign of movement. Then, without warning, the truck's engine roared to life on its own, the lights flickering back on. I nearly jumped out of my seat in surprise. I didn't wait to figure out what had just happened. I threw the truck into gear and hit the gas, speeding down the highway as fast as I could. My heart was pounding, and I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see those figures chasing after me. But the road behind me was empty, just as it had been before. Still, the feeling of being watched lingered, crawling over my skin like a persistent itch. After what felt like an eternity, the highway finally gave way to more familiar roads, and the strange, oppressive atmosphere began to lift. I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding, my body trembling from the adrenaline. I wanted to believe it was all in my head, that the exhaustion had played tricks on me. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. When I reached the next town, I stopped at a diner to gather my thoughts and take a break. As I sat there, nursing a cup of coffee, I overheard two locals talking about the same stretch of highway I'd just driven through. They spoke in hushed tones, mentioning drivers who'd seen the same figures I had. Some claimed they were spirits of people who had died in accidents along the road, while others said they were something far more sinister. Curiosity got the better of me, and I asked the waitress if she knew anything about the highway. She gave me a look I'll never forget, part sympathy, part fear. "You were lucky," she said quietly. "Most people who see them don't come back the same." I left the diner with a heavy heart, the weight of what I'd experienced settling in. The road had let me go, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I had only just escaped. Every time I drive through that part of the state now, I take the long way around, even if it costs me time. I've heard too many stories to risk going back, because once you've driven down that stretch of haunted highway, you never forget it. And you never stop wondering if the figures are still out there, waiting for the next traveler who dares to pass through. The trip was supposed to be a fun weekend getaway, just a group of friends camping out in the woods, far away from the city. We packed up our gear, loaded the cars, and made the drive out to a popular campground deep in the forest. The place was perfect. Tall trees, a clear lake nearby, and plenty of trails for hiking. We set up our tents in a small clearing, laughing and joking about how this was exactly what we all needed: some peace, quiet, and a little adventure. The first night was uneventful. We cooked over the fire, told stories, and enjoyed the cool night air. As the fire burned down and we settled into our tents, I remember thinking how peaceful it all was. There was something comforting about being surrounded by nature, miles away from civilization. I drifted off to sleep without a second thought. The next morning, though, something felt off. As we gathered around the fire pit to make breakfast, one of our friends, Sarah, mentioned that she had heard something outside her tent during the night, rustling, like someone or something was walking around. We all laughed it off, assuming it was just an animal, maybe a raccoon looking for food. It was the woods, after all. Strange noises were bound to happen, but that evening, things took a turn. As the sun began to set, we noticed something odd. A few of our belongings were missing. Small things like a flashlight, a jacket, and a water bottle. We searched the area, thinking we had just misplaced them, but they were nowhere to be found. Again, we chalked it up to our own forgetfulness. But there was a growing unease that none of us could quite shake. That night, as we sat around the fire, the woods seemed different. The usual nighttime sounds, crickets, the rustling of leaves, were muted, replaced by an eerie silence. Every crackle of the fire felt louder, and every shadow seemed to stretch a little too far. At one point, I thought I saw something move just beyond the tree line, but when I turned my head, there was nothing there. It was past midnight when we finally decided to turn in. As I climbed into my tent, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and every little noise outside made my heart race. I told myself it was just my imagination playing tricks on me, but sleep didn't come easily that night. Sometime in the early hours of the morning, I was jolted awake by a sharp noise. It was a snapping sound, like a twig breaking underfoot. I held my breath, listening closely. There it was again. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving around the campsite. My heart pounded in my chest as I peeked out of the tent. In the faint glow of the dying fire, I saw a figure moving between the trees, just beyond the campsite. I froze, unsure of what to do. The figure was tall, cloaked in shadows, and moving with a strange, deliberate slowness. They weren't one of us. I ducked back into my tent, my mind racing. Should I wake the others? Should I call out? Before I could decide, the footsteps stopped. I waited in silence, my heart pounding, but the figure didn't return. In the morning, we all compared notes. Sarah had heard the footsteps too, and she wasn't the only one. 2 others in our group had woken up to the same sound. Someone walking around the campsite, just out of view. We searched the area, but there was no sign of anyone. That's when we noticed the scratches on one of the tents, deep gouges in the fabric, as if someone had dragged a sharp object across it. Panic began to set in. This wasn't an animal, and it wasn't just our imagination. Someone was out there, watching us, messing with us. We decided to pack up and leave immediately. As we hurried to break down the campsite, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Every time I glanced at the tree line, I half expected to see that figure standing there, waiting. As we hiked back to the cars, the unease only grew. The forest, once beautiful and serene, now felt oppressive, like it was closing in around us. Every rustle of leaves made me jump, and I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see someone following us. But the woods remained silent. When we finally reached the cars, we all breathed a sigh of relief. We loaded up as quickly as we could, eager to get out of there. But just as we were about to leave, one of my friends, Mark, pointed out something strange. Carved into the bark of a nearby tree was a symbol, rough, jagged lines forming a circle with an X through it. It hadn't been there when we arrived. The drive home was quiet. None of us spoke about what had happened, but the fear was palpable. We all knew something had been out there with us, watching us, stalking us. We never went back to that campground, and to this day, I wonder who or what had been lurking in the woods that night. Whatever it was, it had been too close for comfort. When my partner and I moved into the house, it seemed like the perfect place to start our new life together. The quiet suburban neighborhood had everything we wanted: peace, privacy, and a sense of community. The house itself was spacious, with a large yard and an old-fashioned charm. It had been on the market for a while, which surprised us, but we didn't question our luck. We were just excited to call it home. One weekend, while unpacking boxes and getting settled in, we decided to explore the basement. It was a large, unfinished space, perfect for storing extra things, and maybe even turning into a home gym one day. But as we moved some old shelves and boxes left by the previous owners, we noticed something strange. There was a section of the wall that didn't quite match the rest, like it had been hastily sealed up at some point. The plaster was rough, and the outline of a door was barely visible beneath it. Curiosity got the better of us. We grabbed a few tools and, after some work, managed to break through the plaster. Behind it, we found a door, a small, rusted one, almost hidden in the far corner of the basement. It was as if someone had gone to great lengths to ensure it stayed hidden. My partner and I exchanged uneasy glances but couldn't resist opening it. What we found on the other side still haunts me. The door led to a small, windowless room. It smelled musty, like it hadn't been touched in years. The walls were bare except for one side, where someone had carved strange, unsettling symbols into the wood. In the center of the room was an old chair, surrounded by dusty toys and bits of furniture that looked like they belonged to a child. The sight of those worn-out toys sent a chill down my spine. As we explored the room, we discovered something even more disturbing. There was a message scratched into the wall near the floor, barely visible in the dim light. It read, "Don't let them out." My heart raced as I tried to make sense of it. What had happened in this room? Why had it been sealed off like this? The more I thought about it, the more unsettled I became. That night, after we'd finished cleaning up and tried to push the discovery from our minds, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the room, the toys, and that cryptic message. My partner tried to reassure me, saying it was probably just the work of a disturbed previous owner. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The house, which had once felt so welcoming, now felt cold, like it was holding on to a dark secret. Over the next few days, strange things started happening. At first, it was small, objects going missing, lights flickering, doors that we swore we'd closed standing ajar. We chalked it up to stress and our minds playing tricks on us. But then the noises began. In the middle of the night, we would hear faint whispers coming from the basement, barely audible but unmistakable. My partner and I both heard it, though we tried to pretend we hadn't. One night, I woke up to the sound of footsteps coming from downstairs. At first, I thought my partner had gotten up, but when I rolled over, I saw they were still fast asleep. My stomach tightened with dread as I realized the footsteps weren't coming from upstairs, they were coming from the basement. I lay there, frozen, listening as the soft thudding of feet echoed through the house. The next day, we decided to investigate. Armed with flashlights and a growing sense of dread, we went down to the basement. The door to the hidden room was still closed, but the air felt heavy, like something was waiting just beyond it. We stood there, staring at the door, neither of us wanting to be the first to open it. Finally, my partner reached out and turned the handle. Inside, the room was exactly as we had left it, except for one thing. The chair, which had been in the center of the room, was now pushed up against the wall, and the toys, which had been scattered around, were neatly arranged in a line facing the door. My heart pounded in my chest as I realized that someone, or something, had been in the room. We left the basement and called the realtor to ask if they knew anything about the previous owners. The response we got only made things worse. The house had been sold multiple times over the years, and no one had stayed for more than a few months. Each owner had reported strange occurrences, and many had sealed off parts of the basement to keep the bad energy contained. No one could explain what had happened, but there were rumors, dark, unsettling stories about a family that had lived there long ago, whose youngest child had vanished without a trace. After that, the whispers grew louder. It wasn't just at night anymore. We could hear them during the day, faint and insistent, like voices just out of reach. The lights flickered constantly, and we started finding things moved around the house, as if someone was living there with us. The sense of being watched became overwhelming. Every time we went into the basement, the air was thick with tension, and the hidden room seemed to radiate a coldness that chilled us to the bone. Eventually, we couldn't take it anymore. We packed up and left the house, abandoning it before whatever was in that room could take hold of us too. Even now, I still hear the whispers sometimes, in the dead of night, reminding me of what we found in that hidden room. Whatever was sealed behind that door should have stayed hidden. Some secrets are better left undisturbed. It was just another typical evening in our quiet suburban neighborhood. I was out walking my dog, as I did every evening, enjoying the peaceful streets lined with neatly kept lawns and cozy homes. There was nothing unusual about the night, until I noticed it. At the very end of the street, a house I had never seen before seemed to appear out of nowhere. It was strange because I had walked this route for months, and I was sure that no house had been there before. The house was old, much older than the rest in the neighborhood. Its paint was faded, the windows dark, and the front yard overgrown with weeds. The place looked abandoned, yet there was something about it that caught my attention. Maybe it was the way the porch light flickered on as I approached, or how the shadows seemed to shift unnaturally around the building. I paused, staring at it for a moment, a chill running down my spine. The next day, I couldn't stop thinking about the house. I asked my neighbors if they knew anything about it, but they all looked at me like I was crazy. "There's no house at the end of the street," one of them said, laughing it off. Another neighbor swore up and down that the last house on the street was an empty lot, nothing more, but I knew what I had seen. That night, I decided to walk the same route again, just to prove to myself that the house had been real. Sure enough, as I neared the end of the street, there it was. The same old, decrepit house standing where it hadn't been just days before. This time, though, something felt even more wrong. The air around it was heavy, almost oppressive, and I could hear faint noises coming from inside, like distant whispers or the creaking of floorboards. My dog refused to go any closer, pulling at the leash in the opposite direction. Against my better judgment, I decided to take a closer look. I stepped up onto the porch, the wood creaking under my weight, and peered into one of the dusty windows. The inside was dark, but I could just make out the shape of furniture, a couch, a table, and what looked like a few old paintings hanging crookedly on the walls. It felt like the house had been frozen in time, abandoned long ago, but somehow untouched. As I turned to leave, something caught my eye. In one of the upstairs windows, I saw a figure. It was there only for a split second, a shadowy outline of a person standing perfectly still, watching me. My heart skipped a beat as I stumbled back, nearly tripping over the steps. When I looked up again, the figure was gone, and the window was dark. I rushed home, my mind racing. The house was real. There was no doubt about it. But how could my neighbors not see it? I spent the next few days trying to find out more about the place, but there was nothing. No records, no mention of it in any local history books, and no one in the neighborhood seemed to remember it ever being there. Then, one night, as I was walking past the house again, I heard something. It was faint, almost like a whisper, calling my name. I stopped in my tracks, staring at the dark windows. The front door, which had been closed just moments before, was now slightly ajar. The invitation was clear, but every instinct in my body screamed at me to stay away. Still, something pulled me toward the house. I stepped onto the porch, my heart pounding in my chest. As I pushed the door open, a cold breeze rushed past me, and the whispers grew louder. The inside of the house was even more unsettling than I had imagined. The furniture was old and decayed, covered in dust and cobwebs. But what caught my attention was the hallway. It was lined with photographs, all of them depicting the same family over and over again. The more I looked at the photos, the more disturbed I became. The family in the pictures never aged. The same mother, father, and 2 children, all smiling eerily in every frame, as if they had been frozen in time. At the end of the hallway, there was a large, ornate mirror. As I approached it, I noticed something odd. The reflection wasn't quite right. The hallway behind me looked darker, and in the reflection, the door was closed, trapping me inside. Panic surged through me as I turned to leave, but as I did, the front door slammed shut on its own, sealing me in the house. The whispers grew louder, more urgent, and I could feel a presence closing in around me. I rushed toward the door, pulling at the handle, but it wouldn't budge. My breathing quickened as I glanced back at the hallway. The mirror's reflection was shifting, warping, and in the reflection, I could see them, the family from the photographs, standing at the end of the hall, watching me. I don't know how, but I managed to force the door open and stumbled out into the night, gasping for breath. When I looked back, the house was completely dark, the front door closed as if nothing had happened. I ran all the way home, the feeling of being watched lingering over me like a dark cloud. The next day, I went back to the spot at the end of the street, but the house was gone. In its place was an empty lot, overgrown with weeds, just like my neighbors had said. No one believed me when I told them about the house, and I haven't seen it since. But every so often, I still feel that cold breeze, and I hear those faint whispers, as if the house is calling me back. The cabin by the frozen lake was exactly what I needed. Isolated, quiet, and far away from the stress of everyday life. It was winter, and the snow-covered landscape stretched for miles, with nothing but the frozen lake and the dense forest around me. I'd rented the place for a solo retreat, hoping to clear my head and find some peace. It wasn't easy to get to, tucked deep in the wilderness, but that was part of its charm. No distractions, no neighbors, just me and nature. The first couple of days were peaceful. I spent my time reading by the fire, hiking through the snow-covered woods, and taking in the serene beauty of the frozen lake. The cold air was crisp, and the silence was calming. At night, I'd bundle up in the warmth of the cabin, the fire crackling in the fireplace, and drift off to sleep without a care in the world. It was the perfect escape. On the 3rd night, something changed. I had just settled into bed when I heard a knock on the door. It was soft, almost hesitant, but clear enough to wake me. I sat up, confused. No one else was supposed to be out here. I listened for a moment, thinking maybe I had imagined it, but then the knock came again, a little louder this time. I got out of bed and made my way to the door, my heart racing. Peering through the small window, I saw nothing but darkness. The snow outside was undisturbed, and the lake, frozen solid, was still as glass. I opened the door slowly, but there was no one there. Just the cold night air and the silence of the woods. A shiver ran down my spine, but I convinced myself it must have been the wind. I locked the door and went back to bed, trying to push the strange event from my mind. The next morning, as I stepped outside to get some firewood, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Footprints. Clear, deep footprints in the snow, leading from the edge of the frozen lake, right up to the cabin door. My heart pounded as I knelt down to inspect them. They were fresh, far too large to belong to any animal. Someone had been here during the night, knocking on my door, but I had seen no one. I scanned the area, but the tracks ended abruptly at the edge of the lake. There was no sign of anyone else around, no other footprints leading away. The idea that someone had been watching me, standing outside in the freezing cold, unsettled me deeply. I tried to rationalize it, thinking maybe a lost hiker had wandered through, but that didn't explain why the tracks stopped at the lake. That night, I locked all the doors and windows, double-checking everything before I went to bed. Sleep didn't come easily, and I lay there for hours, listening to the sounds of the cabin creaking in the cold. Then, just past midnight, the knocking returned. It was louder this time, more insistent. My heart raced as I lay there, frozen in fear, not daring to move. The knocking continued. Each knock a sharp, deliberate sound that echoed through the cabin. I grabbed the flashlight from the nightstand and made my way to the door, my hands trembling. Peering through the window again, I saw nothing, but I could feel it. Someone was out there, watching, waiting. I held my breath, waiting for the next knock, but after a few moments, it stopped. The following morning, the footprints were back, this time closer to the cabin. They circled the house, leading from the lake, around the building, and stopping at the windows. Whoever, or whatever, was out there had been watching me as I slept. My mind raced as I tried to figure out what to do. There was no phone signal out here, no way to call for help. I was completely alone. I considered leaving, but the snowstorm that had rolled in overnight made it impossible. The roads were impassable, and I was stuck in the cabin until the weather cleared. The thought of spending another night here, knowing that someone was lurking outside, filled me with dread, but I had no choice. That night, the knocking didn't come. Instead, there was something worse. Around 3 a.m., I heard footsteps outside, heavy and deliberate, crunching through the snow. They moved slowly, deliberately, as if whoever was out there was pacing around the cabin. I lay in bed, my heart pounding, trying to stay as quiet as possible. Then, I heard it, scratching at the windows, like fingernails dragging across the glass. I wanted to scream, but I stayed silent, hoping that if I didn't move, whoever, or whatever, it was would go away. The scratching continued for what felt like an eternity, moving from window to window, until finally, it stopped. I didn't sleep at all that night, my mind racing with fear. The next morning, I found the footprints again, but this time, they didn't stop at the edge of the lake. They led directly onto the frozen surface, disappearing into the distance. I stood there, staring at the lake, wondering what kind of person would walk out onto the ice in the middle of the night. The thought sent a shiver down my spine, and I retreated back to the cabin. I stayed one more night, unable to leave because of the snowstorm. The knocking didn't return, but I heard the footsteps again, this time on the roof. They paced back and forth, slow and steady, as if whatever was out there was waiting for me to come out. I didn't dare move. When the storm finally cleared, I packed my things and left the cabin, driving through the snow as fast as I could. As I glanced back one last time, I saw it. More footprints, leading from the lake right up to the front door. I've never returned to that cabin, and I've never been able to explain what happened during those nights. But every winter, when the lake freezes over, I think about those footprints and the knocking and the feeling of being watched. Something was out there, and I was lucky to get away. It was supposed to be a simple cross-country drive. My girlfriend and I had been on the road for hours, and the endless stretch of desert highway seemed to go on forever. We hadn't seen another car in what felt like miles, and the sun had just dipped below the horizon, casting an orange glow over the landscape. As the night set in, the road became darker, and the thought of finding somewhere to stretch our legs grew more appealing. That's when we saw it, a sign for a rest stop up ahead. The rest stop appeared out of nowhere, just off the highway, and I almost missed the exit. It looked old, run down, and a bit forgotten. but we were desperate for a break. I turned off the highway and pulled into the parking lot. There was something unsettling about the place. The building was small, the lights were flickering, and the silence was overwhelming. The empty lot made me feel like we were the only two people left in the world. We stepped out of the car, and the cool night air hit us. The only sounds were the soft crunch of gravel beneath our feet and the faint hum of the wind. The rest stop looked like it hadn't been used in years. Graffiti covered the walls, and the windows were broken. A faint, musty smell lingered in the air, but we figured it was just the smell of an old, abandoned place. Despite the eerie vibe, we both needed a break, so we decided to check it out. The restroom was dimly lit, with one flickering light bulb casting long, distorted shadows on the walls. The smell of mildew was strong, and the mirrors were fogged over. My girlfriend went into one of the stalls while I leaned against the sink, staring at the graffiti on the walls. Most of it was just random words and drawings, but one phrase caught my attention. "They never leave." The words were scratched into the wall, deep and jagged. I felt a chill run down my spine. I stepped outside, hoping to shake off the uneasy feeling, but it didn't help. The parking lot was still empty, the desert stretching out into the darkness. The wind had picked up, whistling through the broken windows of the building. I glanced back at the rest stop, and for a split second, I thought I saw movement in one of the windows, a shadow, or maybe just a trick of the light. I blinked, and it was gone. When my girlfriend came out, I told her I thought we should leave. She didn't argue. Something about the place was off, and we both felt it. We headed back to the car, eager to get back on the road, but when I turned the key in the ignition, nothing happened. The car wouldn't start. I tried again, but the engine was dead. My heart sank as panic started to creep in. We were stranded. We sat in the car for a few minutes, trying to figure out what to do. My phone had no signal, and hers was dead. The nearest town was miles away, and we hadn't seen any other cars on the road for hours. The thought of spending the night here in this abandoned rest stop sent a wave of fear through me. But what choice did we have? Without thinking, I got out of the car, determined to confront whoever or whatever was there. I stepped around the side of the building, my heart pounding in my chest, but the only thing I found was more graffiti and broken windows. No people, no signs of anyone, just an empty building and the eerie quiet of the night. When I returned to the car, my girlfriend was pale, her eyes fixed on something in the distance. "There," she whispered, pointing toward the road. I followed her gaze and saw them. Figures standing at the edge of the parking lot, barely visible in the darkness. There were at least 3 of them, their silhouettes outlined by the faint glow of the flickering rest stop lights. They were standing still, watching us. My blood turned cold. I knew we had to leave. I tried the car one more time, and miraculously, the engine roared to life. I didn't wait for an explanation. I slammed on the gas and tore out of the parking lot, my hands gripping the wheel tightly as we sped back onto the highway. I glanced in the rearview mirror, but the figures were gone. We drove in silence for a few miles, our minds racing. The car had no problems after that. It started fine, and we eventually made it to the next town. But neither of us could shake the feeling that we had narrowly escaped something terrible. When we stopped at a diner to collect our thoughts, I asked the waitress if she knew anything about the rest stop we had passed. Her expression changed immediately. "That place has been closed for years," she said quietly. "There were stories about people going missing near there, travelers who never made it back on the road. Most folks avoid it now. I've never gone back to that stretch of highway, and I never will. Whatever was at that rest stop, those figures, those footsteps, I don't want to find out. Some places are best left alone, forgotten by time and untouched by the living." I had been driving long-haul roads for years, and late-night highways had become a second home to me. There's a certain rhythm to the road in the dead of night. Just you, the hum of the engine, and the black ribbon of asphalt stretching ahead. On this particular night, though, the road felt different. It was quieter, more isolating than usual. The sky was dark, no stars, no moon, just the dense blackness swallowing everything beyond the reach of my headlights. It was about 2 a.m. when I spotted something up ahead on the shoulder. At first, it looked like a broken-down car. As I got closer, I saw a family standing beside it. A man, a woman, and 2 children. They were waving me down, their faces etched with desperation. I slowed down, the idea of stopping weighing heavily on me. Out here, miles from anywhere, it wasn't unusual to see stranded travelers, but something about this family made me hesitate. Still, I couldn't just leave them. I pulled over a few feet ahead of their car and stepped out, calling out to them. "You folks need some help?" I shouted over the sound of the engine. They didn't respond immediately, just stood there, watching me. I took a step closer, but as I did, a chill ran down my spine. The air around them felt wrong, too cold for the time of year, too still. And then I realized their car didn't look quite right. The headlights were off, but the windows were fogged up like someone had been inside recently. As I stood there, trying to make sense of what I was seeing, the man took a step forward, his face still hidden in the shadows. "We need a ride," he said, his voice low and eerie. Something in his tone made my skin crawl. I glanced at the woman and children. They weren't moving, just staring at me with wide, unblinking eyes. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. "Sorry, I don't have room," I stammered, backing away slowly. My instincts were screaming at me to get back in the truck. The man didn't say anything, but as I turned to leave, I noticed something chilling. There were no tracks in the dirt around their car. No footprints, no tire marks, nothing to indicate they had driven there or even walked along the road. I jumped back into the truck and slammed the door shut, my heart racing. As I pulled back onto the highway, I glanced in the rearview mirror, expecting to see them still standing there. But they were gone, vanished into thin air. My pulse pounded in my ears, and I gripped the steering wheel, trying to shake off the fear creeping over me. Maybe I was just overtired, seeing things. But deep down, I knew that wasn't it. I drove for miles, trying to put distance between myself and whatever I had just encountered. But the uneasy feeling lingered, growing stronger with every passing minute. And then, out of nowhere, my truck's lights flickered, and the engine sputtered. My heart sank as the dashboard lights dimmed. The truck slowed to a crawl before the engine cut out completely, leaving me stranded in the middle of the highway. I cursed under my breath and grabbed my phone. No signal. Of course, I was miles from the nearest town, and now I was stuck on the side of the road with nothing but darkness around me. I stepped out of the truck, hoping to spot another car, but the highway was empty, eerily silent. I walked a few paces from the truck, scanning the horizon, but all I could see was the endless stretch of road disappearing into the night. That's when I heard it, footsteps behind me. Slow, measured steps growing closer. I spun around, but no one was there. My heart pounded in my chest as I backed up toward the truck, every nerve in my body on edge. The footsteps continued, circling the truck, though I couldn't see anyone. I jumped back into the cab, locking the doors, and sat there, breathless, listening as the footsteps grew louder, closer. I glanced in the rearview mirror, and that's when I saw them. The family, the man, the woman, and the 2 children, were sitting in the back of my truck, staring at me through the rear window. Their faces were pale, their eyes hollow, and their mouths twisted into strange, unsettling smiles. My blood turned cold. They hadn't just vanished, they had followed me. I tried to start the truck, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the keys. The engine sputtered but refused to turn over. I could feel their eyes on me, watching, waiting. The air in the cab grew colder, and a strange, oppressive weight settled over me. I looked back again, and they were closer now, pressed up against the glass, their faces distorted and unnatural. Desperation set in as I turned the key one last time, and finally, the engine roared to life. I didn't wait for anything else to happen. I floored the gas, speeding down the highway, my heart racing. I could still feel their presence behind me, lingering like a shadow that wouldn't leave. It wasn't until I was miles down the road that the weight in the air lifted, and the temperature returned to normal. I pulled over at a rest stop, my hands still trembling. I sat there for a long time, trying to process what had just happened. I wanted to believe it had all been a hallucination, brought on by exhaustion, but I knew better. Something was wrong with that stretch of highway, and that family. They weren't just stranded travelers. They were something else, something that had been haunting that road for a long time. To this day, I avoid that highway. I don't care if it adds hours to my trip. I'll never drive that stretch again. Because some ghosts don't just haunt the places they died. They haunt the people who crossed their path. And I'm not about to cross theirs again.